All right, so I want to start by saying three things to tee up today's discussion. The first relates to Silicon Flatirons itself. The second relates to CU and entrepreneurship more broadly. And then the third relates to the roadmap for where we're going today. First, this is the second to last event on the Silicon Flatirons Entrepreneurship Initiative calendar for this year. It seems like we've been fairly busy, and I thought it would be a good time to do a by-the-numbers accounting, and I think it turns out that we have been fairly busy. From September 2009 to May 2010, so for this academic year, we've hosted 9 Boulder New Tech meetups in this room. We've had 19 startup companies who have been served through the Entrepreneurial Law Clinic, and additionally, those student attorneys have done 6 outreach presentations into the startup community. We've hosted 4 crash courses here. We've had 5 New Venture Challenge workshops, plus 3 additional New Venture Challenge events. We've had 10 Entrepreneurs Unplugged events, and finally, today's academic conference. So for those taking notes at home, that adds up to 31 events from September 2009 to May 2010, about 5,500 attendees coming through. And the Entrepreneurship Initiative is really only one of 3 parts of Silicon Flatirons. I want to highlight that Dale Hatfield is here, the Executive Director of Silicon Flatirons. He leads the telecom policy piece as well. Dale, for those of you who have not met him, is a terrific asset here and has been busy shuttling between Boulder and Washington, D.C., where he's been hosting Silicon Flatirons events in D.C., sometimes in parallel with what we're doing here. And additionally, Professor Paul Ohm, who leads the intellectual property, privacy, and security piece of Silicon Flatirons. For those of you who have not attended one of those events, you cannot go and walk out and not think, wow, I learned far more than I ever expected possible. Paul is doing a terrific job with that as well. Overall, Silicon Flatirons is going to do 50-plus events this year, and that's fairly remarkable. It doesn't just happen. We have a great team that we're fortunate to have on board. I want to highlight some of the efforts. Jamie Stewart, I don't know if Jamie's here. Jamie, can you wave outside? Okay. Came on board this year. We have a fellow who's a former CU Law student and has made a big contribution this spring, Caleb C., who's going to be here a little bit later. And then at the center of the vortex for all these 50-plus events is our really remarkable program director, Anna Noskesi. A round of applause for the folks who are making this happen. Okay, so second point is across campus, I think the Silicon Flatirons Entrepreneurship Initiative is part of a good story brewing. I want to highlight a couple things. First is that this is the penultimate event of CU's Entrepreneurship Week, and in fact, I just returned from a luncheon hosted by the Deming Center and the Colorado Initiative for Molecular Biology, which was across campus. Catherine Marigold was speaking there, and Tom Check announced that there's a $15 million grant which is going to go towards helping build a new facility in Boulder around biology and entrepreneurship, so that's a good thing. And additionally, I think the best reflection of the cross-campus story is the New Venture Challenge. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the New Venture Challenge is styled as an entrepreneurial launch pad. It is for someone like Marshall, who's a student finishing up a JD MBA in the back, who says, entrepreneurship sounds like an interesting way to craft a life. Where would I start? And the New Venture Challenge is an answer. We kicked it off last November with a crash course in here. Paul Berberian had 250 people attend. From that, 40 teams were formed and matched with 40 mentors in the community. A series of workshops and mentor interactions ensued. That was whittled down to 8 semifinalists. And then last Friday, we selected a winner. More than anything that I've seen across CU, this collapses the campus. The geographic barriers, the buildings are brought together, and we were able to put engineering students with law students, with B students, with music students, configurations that don't get together very often. And then additionally, it reflected the cooperation of several entities across campus. So the Deming Center was a full partner on this, Atlas, eShip, ITP, Tech Transfer Office, and Silicon Flatirons brought it off. And so I want to recognize those campus partners who are all part of Entrepreneurship Week and making things happen at CU. Third, finally, a roadmap for today's conference. The thread that permeates today is the relationship between place and innovation, and we're going to approach this topic through 3 very different prisms. The first panel is about people who want to come to a place in order to innovate, and we'll be discussing immigration and startups, and in particular, a startup visa proposal that is out there. Second panel will take a look at this place the Front Range, and a particular industry, the data storage industry. And for those of you who have seen some of the posters, they're here and out. Really a fairly amazing story there in terms of the depth of rich companies that have been spawned in this area. And the second panel is going to inquire, why did that happen here? And what lessons could be learned going forward for other industries? And then our third panel, take a look at the relationship between place innovation today and going forward into a broadband world. And there you've got two dueling banjos. One is the Thomas Friedman perspective that the world is flat, that given a broadband connection, you can innovate without having to emigrate, versus the work of economic geographers such as Richard Florida, who have shown that, if anything, migration trends suggest that place might matter more today than ever, and that may well be the case going forward. If you're interested in reading further, Dave has done a terrific job of pulling together several materials for this conference, including the readings, which are in your program. And this being an academic institution, we'll have a test outside at the reception for those of you who want to be tested on the readings. Commend that to your attention. Each of today's panels, in terms of format, will start with a 10-minute presentation, which will sharpen up the issues for the panel discussion. 60 minutes of discussion will ensue, about the last 15 minutes of which will be Q&A with the audience. So if I could have the first panel come to the front of the room, we'll get started, and Dave's going to fire up the PowerPoint. While we're getting that set up, let me take a moment to introduce Vivek Wadhwa. Vivek is a senior research associate with the Labor and Work-Life Program at Harvard Law School. He's an executive in residence and adjunct professor at the Pratt School of Engineering at Duke University, an advisor to several startup companies, a columnist for BusinessWeek.com, contributor to several international publications, really one of the leading authorities on entrepreneurship, skilled immigration, and university research commercialization. Please help me in welcoming Vivek Wadhwa.
I'm going to give you a crash course in immigration in 10 minutes. First of all, everyone agrees and everyone knows that America is a land of immigrants. But what I've seen firsthand is the dynamics that have been at play for the last few centuries. That you've had waves of immigrants coming here. You had the Irish, you had the Polish, you had the Jews, you had the Chinese and the Indians and so on. And what's made America what it is that every wave of immigrants coming in here challenged the ones before it. What they did was that they took jobs away. They made people compete for their jobs. They compete for their livelihood. They made them work harder. When you're an immigrant, you're more motivated than most people are because you've left everything behind. You've come to a new land, and you have to learn the language. You have to deal with discrimination, and you have to make right things right for your children. That's been the motivating factor for all of the immigrants that have come to America. So I'm going to walk you through what the latest wave of immigrants have done and the dynamic that's happening for the first time in American history, which is a reverse brain drain. So far, all of the immigrants who've come here, whether they came on the Mayflower or whether they came on Air India, came on one-way tickets because there were no opportunities abroad. The world has changed. Now, what's happening in the United States is that at the same time that you have all of these dynamics at play, you also have a building xenophobia, that the anti-immigrant rhetoric is at an all-time high again, as it has been decades ago. And what's happening is it's driving people away. So I'm going to try to go through my data and my research on that very, very quickly to set the stage for this and tell you why the work that Brad Feld has been doing on the startup visa is so important, why it could be the lifeblood of many communities. Okay. First of all, look at the data on engineering degrees in the United States. This is our schools. This is our universities across America. Nearly 60% of all the PhDs go to foreign nationals. 43% of our masters go to foreign nationals. Now, I'll start off by issuing a disclaimer. I got nothing against foreign nationals. But the issue over here that you're going to see is when the foreign nationals come here and they leave, that's when it creates a brain drain. It's a problem for America. Now, here's some startling data. That all the startups from 1995 to 2005, in the midst of the dot-com boom, the greatest period of economic growth and innovation in American history, probably, 25.3% of all the startups nationwide, 52% of those in Silicon Valley were founded by immigrants. Just think about it, the dot-com boom, the tech boom, all of the great stuff we had happening during the internet days and beyond. More than half of the startups were founded by people who were like me, who were born abroad, who had funny accents, who looked weird, and who basically weren't a product of America. 52%. There's a lot of. I write a lot about immigration, and I have been doing a lot of research. I get death threats. I've gotten several death threats even over the last few months. So, these people claim that these immigrants are taking jobs away. But if you look at the hard data here, that just in 2005, the revenue generated by these immigrant-founded companies was $52 billion. They employed nearly 500,000 workers. If you added up all the permanent resident visas, now the way immigrants come to America is that they come as students on student visas, or they come on temporary visas called H-1 visas. Once you decide that you want to stay here, you start the process of filing for permanent residence. It's called a green card. When I came here in 1980, it took me 18 months to get a green card. If I was to come here today as a student, it would take me 20 or 30 years to get a green card, and I'm going to talk about that. But if you added up all the green cards issued in the decade before that, it was probably about 250,000. So in other words, 450,000 jobs, 250,000 people came in. Clearly, this is not a scientific study, but clearly, they've created more jobs than they've taken away. Now, my Indian buddies have been more active at starting companies than have been the rest. They founded more than the next four groups, from the UK, China, Taiwan, and Japan combined. Also, global patents. It's not only startups. It's also innovation. The most valuable patents are our global patents, which are filed with the WIPO database. A quarter of them had foreign national authors. 40% of the U.S. government's patents had foreign national authors. So there's something amazing happening over here. Now, Colorado basically is well behind the times. If you look at the immigrant-founded states, you're on the left side, which means you're below the norm. You can tell by looking at this audience, it's mostly a white group you have over here. You walk around Boulder, most of the people I saw were middle-class white people, which is very different than what you see if you go to Silicon Valley. We can discuss this thing, what that means, whether it's good or bad, but the fact is that it's something that you have to be aware of, that you have a community that's not entirely in sync with the rest of the nation. Now, the background of immigrant entrepreneurs, is it that they're smarter than others? What happens is that the people who make it here tend to be better educated than the average people are back home. So that of the people who started these companies, nearly all of them had bachelor's degrees, three-quarters had master's, and three-quarters of these degrees were in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now, here's the problem I talked about, that we have a case right now that we brought in about 500,000 skilled workers plus their families, which is about 1 million people who are now waiting for green cards. There are no visas available. We keep talking about the illegals who jumped across the border. The estimates I heard have been between 9 and 12 million. There are millions of people who came here legally through the front door, who are working for American companies, filing patents, helping our competitiveness, who are waiting for green cards. We only allow 120,000 of them in per year. Indians are the number one group. Chinese are the number two group. They had the same quota as do people from Mongolia, as Iceland. In other words, of this 120,000 number, only 7% from any country can take advantage of that visa. So there are 8,400 visas available for Indians every year, despite the fact there are 1/3 or more waiting for green cards. So in other words, it could take forever for people from India who have masters and PhDs to get permanent residency over here. I wrote a paper 3 years ago predicting a massive reverse brain drain. And if you read the front pages of American newspapers right now, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, you name it, they're all writing stories about the massive reverse brain drain that's in process right now. I also surveyed people who came to the United States and went back. As I said, for the first time in American history, you have a reverse migration. We found basically was they came here for education and professional development. They thought that things would be wonderful in America. And then they went back. Why did they go back? Because they had better career opportunities in their home countries. What happened here over the last 15 years was that the rest of the world started rising very rapidly. They adapted our ideals, they adapted capitalism, they adapted our way of working and thinking, and basically the economies of India and China are rising. There are more opportunities for my students back home than there are for them in the United States right now. And yet we basically hammer them and we try to make them feel like third-class citizens.
Sorry, what is the basis for those numbers?
We interviewed 1,200 returnees to India and China. Basically, out of a factor of 5.
Is that percent?
No, it's a ranking based on a factor of 5. I only have 10 minutes to give present a lot of data. I'm trying to compress it. But all of these papers have been published. If you go to my website, which I'll put up, You can go through them and analyze what I've put forward. We asked them how they're doing back home, and if you look at all these factors here, the bottom line was that they went back because they wanted to care for their aging parents. They missed their friends and family. They expected their children to do better back home, and so on and so on. This is why they went back, and things were indeed much better back home for them. Professionally, these data show how they're doing professionally. By every measure, they're doing much better back home than they are in the United States. The point of these slides was to show you that people who've come over here working for our companies are stuck in immigration limbo right now have great opportunities back home. The ones who've already gone back are doing much better. They moved up. For example, 11% of the returnees to India were working in senior management positions when they left the United States. 44% became senior managers when they went back home. What they told us was that they were doing better professionally, they were doing better personally, they enjoyed family life back home, the quality of life was even higher, except they were making less absolute money. So things were better for them back home. We also interviewed, more data on them. The average age of the Indians who returned was 30. The average age of Chinese was 33. Very high. If you just look at the stats on their education, very highly educated, very highly entrepreneurial. What I'm saying basically is that right now, this brain drain that's happening, we're losing the cream of the crop. We're losing people who could be starting companies, contributing to U.S. innovation and competitiveness, and doing a lot of good for the United States by creating jobs, except they're going back home because of visa difficulties. We also interviewed 2,000. We also did a survey of 2,000 foreign students. Historically, the stay rates for Indians and Chinese, 93% of Chinese PhDs, 85% of Indian PhDs stayed 5 years and most likely permanently. The National Science Foundation has been looking at it 5 years at a time. The stay rates have been phenomenal. We asked these students what their plans were. Only 6% of the Indians and 9.5% of the Chinese plan to stay in the United States permanently. Everyone else planned to go back home within 1 to 5 years. We asked students where they saw the future. 86% of Indians and 75% of Chinese thought that the future was brighter back home. These are students studying in our colleges, studying in our universities, the same students who used to come here and stay permanently. They headed back home and they're telling friends that things are better back home, and they're hearing from their friends who've gone back home that things are better back home. So this arrogance, this xenophobia that's building in the United States is destructive. We're basically kidding ourselves, and we're basically helping our competition, because when they go back to India and China, they're starting their companies back there. The next Google might not be here. It may well be in Shanghai or New Delhi, simply because we're taking very, very highly skilled people who could be starting half of our tech companies and shipping them overseas. My research is on this website. We're going to be discussing these topics for the next hour.
All right, thanks so much, Vivek. That's really got us started here. Let me just introduce our other two panelists, and then we'll start the discussion. So we have Brad Feld with us here as a local. He's a managing director of the Foundry Group and has been an entrepreneur and investor for the last 20 years. And he has his bachelor's and master's degree from MIT, and his goal, life goal, one of them maybe, is to run a marathon in every state. And at least your website says you're up to 14. Have you done anything in the last?
15.
15. What was the last one?
New Orleans 2 weeks ago.
Okay, good.
I need to update my website. Thanks. Thanks for giving me something else to do.
And we have Lance Nagel, who's a partner at Morgan, Lewis & Bockius in their San Francisco office, and he's in their labor and employment practice. And he has his undergraduate degree from Columbia and a JD degree from NYU. And he, too, is a well-rounded individual who has studied violin at the Juilliard School and ethnology in France. So people are going to bring all kinds of perspectives. All right, so let me get things started off. What I really want to flesh out first is the need for some kind of change in what our immigration laws are. So, Vivek, I just want to ask a follow-up question to your presentation, which is how much of what you're documenting reflects the most recent recession, and how much of it is more a structural problem?
Well, the surveys I did were before the recession started.
Yeah.
In other words, they were already headed back home. I mean, there's no hard data available here, but my estimate, this is a guesstimate put together by me, not backed by academic research, is that over the last 20 years or so, about 50,000 skilled Indians, 50,000 skilled Chinese went back. Mm-hmm. And I spent some time in India and China meeting government officials and putting together, back of the envelope calculations. And my rough estimate is that from last year, moving forward 5 years, 100,000 skilled immigrants will go back to India and to China. And what I'm told is that because of the recession, because of the way things have changed, my estimates are conservative.
Yeah.
That's the first time I've been accused of being conservative.
All right, good. All right, well, maybe Lance, maybe you can start us off then by talking about your perspective on these issues, because I know you see some of this playing out in your practice as well. So you could help us sort of understand, before we talk about what we might do about it, I want to make sure we have a sort of full understanding of what the real problem is.
So I'm on the ground in this sort of battle to keep the talent here. And just to date me, I did the first Apple H1, which was 1983. So I had some perspective about what's happened in the Silicon Valley, your equivalent in California. And it's clear that the view of the government is that immigration is to benefit the immigrants, not the country. That is to say, it's an arrogant view that we're doing it for them, not for us. And I think arrogance sort of runs through basically what you found in terms of people's experience here. And to give you some examples, in 1980, when President Reagan went to Silicon Valley to extol the virtues of American technology, the first company he went to was Daisy Systems. Daisy Systems was started by an Israeli general. He then went to Intel, a company which I think most of you know Andy Grove was also part of. He was the third employee, not the founder. But if he had taken the time to go into the lobby of Intel and just read the patents, he would have seen most of those patents had Israeli, Chinese, and Indian names on that. And today, Intel has 40% of their patents are based upon the work of Indian and Chinese. So there is this sense of American technology and a failure to actually acknowledge that it's built upon global talent. In terms of the political realities, I was involved with the Jordan Commission, which was 1990, when they started thinking about putting a cap on H-1Bs. And I think you probably don't know, but there is a limit on the number of professional workers we can bring in on these H-1B worker visas, which really is the visa that's the backbone of the tech industry. At that time, it was thought that Congress would set it at 65,000, but in their ability to really understand the needs of industry would in fact increase it if the need happened to occur. They, of course, did it only sporadically when they had the dot-com boom, but it's now back to 65,000 and created an enormous problem for our clients with respect to accessing global talent and student talent. With respect to sort of moving into the 21st century, where you don't mind if I sort of go on in the background here, sorry. This issue of I'll take China as an example, since you've taken the India side. I had the
biased.
Well, no, I didn't mean it that way, but I meant there really is these are two major equations in our workforce here. And when Vivek mentioned people are waiting in a kind of limbo, the quota for China for those who have master's degrees is August 22nd, 2005, meaning if they had actually filed something to indicate a desire to immigrate here, that's when they would have had to have filed it only for the next month to be able to finally file the final stage for permanent residency. For China, for China, it's August 22nd, 2005. For India, it's February 1st, 2005. There is very little movement from month to month, so it's not just a consistent movement. You've got probably 500,000 people here who are waiting for immigrant visas at one stage or another, who are finding themselves in a true limbo, obviously feeding into your statistics that they can't live a life here for themselves or their family members. There's also, Brad, for you, bad news in terms of some of those people, which I'll get to in a second, in terms of how can you access them for your startup companies. And I'm going to address that in a second. But I want to give one illustration about the other side of the equation on what countries are doing to attract their people back. It's not just our losing them. It's basically proactively countries reaching out, particularly to bring back their nationals. I've worked with various Chinese organizations for a long time, starting with BIDIC in the 1980s. That's Beijing International Trust and CITIC. And I remember vividly sitting in the free trade zone in Oakland as the sun was going down with the head of the BIDIC office near tears, trying to understand why the Chinese students would come here and flourish and flower, and they couldn't do it in China. He just could not understand what there was in our atmosphere, that intangible, that also creates these pockets of technology and innovation.
Rock and roll, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a rock and roll. And near tears. I should add that he then later came to me, I think a year later, and asked for if I could process a green card for him. But of course I couldn't because I represented BIDIC at the time. But let me move then forward. So this is 1980. About 5 years ago, I was asked by one of the board members of Cadence to speak with Dr. Shah, who was head of the new Z Park. It's the biggest science park in Beijing, in fact, in China. It's 89 square miles. It has 10 sub-parks. It has 23,000 high-tech companies. And he wanted to know how they could best go after the Chinese students to bring them back to China. Because the fact is, they consider our educational system the gold standard. They want to sort of immerse them in what we teach our kids, and then they want them back. And so they have put in an extraordinary amount of effort, money, time, to create basically what you're trying to do here, to seed startup companies, funded by the municipal government of Beijing. That obviously has some drawbacks because governments are not exactly good venture capitalists, and they don't encourage the most extraordinary leaps of faith with respect to investment. But they now produce $147 billion in revenue, which is now 16% of Beijing's GDP, this park. So you can see it's already starting to show extraordinary dividends. I was back in that park a year and a half ago, and I will be there, I think, in May. I'll be back there as well. So then you've seen what is occurring when you have these countries reaching out and bringing their people back. I won't go into the restrictions on student visas. Certainly post 9/11, there have been a closer scrutiny of foreign students coming here. Obviously, some from countries that are more highly suspect in the view of the government than others, but it clearly has diverted a portion of that group to other countries for their educational objectives. And other countries like England have and Europe have the blue visa that they're putting in place, ways to kind of accelerate students' ability to stay and work there. These business backlogs, getting to this H-1B now, are creating enormous dysfunctions for companies which we revere. Take Google, for example. 2 years ago, Google was only able to get half of the H-1Bs it filed because of the quota, the cap. Now, here is one of the premier companies unable to actually access the talent it wanted here. And, of course, they go abroad to try and place them and then create centers abroad. Apple, similar statistics. So what you have here is you have American companies being stunted in their ability to access the talent and to keep the talent. I want to get just briefly to the VC, but
okay. Let me.
That's the background.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And let me just take one moment just to say, because I know we're throwing around a lot of terms, just want to make sure everyone's on the same page when we're just talking about sort of basic immigration law, right? So there are two ways that people can come here. You either come as an immigrant, and that's a sort of term of art in the law, and that means a legal permanent resident or a green card holder is how we often colloquially refer to people because they used to have a green card. It's no longer green. So you come as an immigrant or a non-immigrant. And non-immigrant, you can come as a tourist or a student or on a short-term employment visa. And that's what Lance was talking about, that typically in this industry is the H-1B visa. And that just refers to a part of the Immigration and Nationality Act. But that only allows you to come for 3 years with a possible extension for 6 years. And so the idea is this is not a permanent way to come here. Now, many people come here on the H-1B visa and then are ultimately able to get an immigrant visa, but that's partly what we're talking about is that backlog. So that's one thing I want to tease out here, which is how much of this is the short-term problem of getting people to be here, and how much of this is, in other words, is this a problem with our non-immigrant categories or a problem with our immigrant categories, right? Because the sort of the gold standard, if you're not a citizen, typically is that people want to be able to come as an immigrant because it enables you to stay here for the rest of your life, makes you eligible for citizenship after a certain period of time. It's also much easier to move around. Once you actually have your green card, you can the next day leave, even though your employer sponsors you to get that green card, the next day you can leave that job and never go back. The H-1B visa is a little more complicated. You can switch employers, but it has to be more seamless. So those are two different things. And I just wonder maybe, Brad, if you could weigh in a bit with what you see, both from two perspectives. I think from the company's perspective wanting to hire people, because I think that's also what you're talking about, Lance, as well, but then also people who want to come here to the United States and start up their companies here. So what are you seeing?
Yeah, so I've had three distinct experiences that have shaped my current view on why this is such an important issue to address, and really about the notion of innovation and competitiveness versus anything else as a country. The first was when I was in school, which was 83 to 90 as an undergrad, master's, and doctoral student, and I was at MIT. I was surrounded by people from all different countries, and we lived together. I didn't really have any sense of what the immigration dynamics were. until we started graduating, and some of them had to leave and go back to wherever they came from. And they came from all over the place. Some from Europe, some from Asia, some from, I have a friend from Sri Lanka, and they had very difficult times leaving university and getting a job that would get them on a path to permanent citizenship. They were all, first generation. They didn't have family here. Their family was somewhere else. So I experienced that and sort of tucked it away and didn't pay much attention to it beyond sort of thinking it was strange and bizarre. I was also there were 3 white guys in my PhD program, so I was a token minority in my PhD program, which was very interesting then, because when many of those other people graduated, I didn't, but when many of them did, they had to leave. So it was kind of in my face, but again, I sort of went on and didn't think too hard about it. After I sold my first company and then started investing in other companies, I ran straight into the H-1B problem, because a lot of the companies I was investing in were in the Bay Area. The H-1B issue is more pronounced probably in the Bay Area than in other parts of the country because of the concentration of immigrant population, especially around high-tech companies. I saw again the problem with people that were in master's and PhD programs. I started for the first time seeing not just the joining company problem, but trying to start a company problem. And not just the logistics and the cost, but the uncertainty. And any of you here that are entrepreneurs know that if you're an entrepreneur, your support system is incredibly important to you. Your spouse, your kids, your people around you. Everything in your world when you're an entrepreneur is complete chaos. And you want at least some things that are semi-stable to hang on to as you're putting all of your energy into trying to create something from nothing and putting all your risk there. Well, if you're at risk every time you leave the country, that you're not going to be able to come back into the country, or that somebody arbitrarily somewhere is going to lose the paperwork that you had to file to do something, and now you have 2 weeks and you have to... that's just a whole nother layer of stress. And so I sort of went through that. We also had a guy that worked for us at Mobius who was English, who was trying to get his green card, ended up going through the mechanics of it. He was at the very end of a 6 or 7 year process. He'd gone to school at Stanford, and we had sponsored him after somebody else had sponsored him and all that nonsense. And he ended up in a border town in Mexico because he had to leave the country and come back as part of the process. And the border town he was in had a war. And he was cut off for like 2 days. We couldn't find him. Nobody could find him. People dead in the newspaper. It was crazy. And I remember it so vividly because this was just a guy who literally just took a trip across the border, had to stay overnight or something. I don't remember exactly what the dynamics were for this particular stage, and come back and he was missing and panicked. So I remember that sort of stuck with me. And I always felt that whenever somebody graduated from a U.S. college, they should be able to get, essentially at that moment in time, a green card. Like, it made no sense to me why we wouldn't immediately say, you studied here for 4 years, if you want to stay here, you're here. And especially, you want to put a higher threshold, make it a master's student or PhD student. I don't care, but it just made no sense. So then the third piece of the experience I had, which is the one that mobilized me to actually do something versus just think about it, talk about it, and be agitated about it, was last summer in the Techstars program that we run here. For those of you that know Techstars, 2 of the 10 teams had immigrant founders. One of the teams had a kid from France and a kid from the UK were the co-founders, and one of the teams had a pair of Canadians that were the co-founders. Now, I've always thought the Canadians were very dangerous people because they can drink so much. So I was always very uncomfortable with the idea of letting them into this country, especially if you were in a state that didn't have blue laws on Sunday. And they came on some kind of temporary visa. I don't know what it was. It was probably a visitor visa, and they didn't say that they were working because they weren't really getting paid anything anyway because we don't give them enough money for them to pay themselves. And from the beginning of the summer, for the 90-day program, I would say 25% of the conversation that I had with them, with each of these companies, was trying to figure out how to get them a way to stay at the end of the program. They wanted to stay. They wanted to start their companies in Boulder. All 4 of them fell in love with Boulder, Colorado. They loved the community. They loved the entrepreneurial activity. They wanted to be in the U.S. They had both been in other entrepreneurial communities in northern England and in Canada, and they're like, oh, man, this is nothing. I mean, you got it going here. This is where we want to be. And we went through all of these different approaches, and we found approach after approach after approach, that there's actually no legal way to guarantee that these kids could get visas and, oh, by the way, have their families come with them and then have certainty of being able to stay, which, of course, if you're an investor in a raw startup, you're not going to invest in that company anyway, and so the thing just cascades out of control. So that's what motivated me finally to say this is just stupid. Because really, regardless of whether you're looking at it from the academic vector, you're looking at it from the growth vector in terms of high-growth companies, or you're looking at it from a startup vector perspective, the long-term impact of our behavior as a country fundamentally undermines what's made this country great and resilient long-term. And so that's sort of where my view came from.
Okay, good. No, that's helpful. Now, one thing I really want to sort of try and put a fine point on, which is that the Act already allows, there's something you talked about, sort of the different categories. There's something called the EB-5 category, employment-based categories, which is typically referred to as investor visas. So that's allowing people to come to the United States who have their certain requirements. They have to have $1 million that they're going to invest. They have to be, the idea is that they're starting, these are generally for entrepreneurs, are starting a business that is going to employ at least 10 U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents who can't be the immigrant's own family. And the numbers are somewhat different if they're doing it in areas, in more sort of rural areas. But so there is a mechanism in the Act right now for allowing investors. And so I'm wondering what about that isn't sufficiently addressing the problems that you all are identifying?
Well, let me try to take on a few things because it's lined up with the Startup Visa Act that we're working on. Just for context, there is a bill in the House and a bill in the Senate. The bill in the House, which Jared Polis, who's a Democrat in Colorado, sponsored, and he's now got co-sponsors, is an EB-5 reform bill. The bill in the Senate, which is sponsored by Kerry, who's Democrat in Massachusetts, and Lugar, who's Republican in Indiana, is actually called the Startup Visa Act of 2010, and it creates a new visa class called the EB-6, but that shares this allocation with the EB-5. So it doesn't actually create new visas, it's just a new way to do it. So just with that background, when we started, the group of us that have been working on the Startup Visa movement looked around and got as smart as we could get without killing ourselves over the convoluted nature of a lot of this immigration stuff, which bless you for spending your whole career on.
I get to travel. That's
and he makes big money.
We looked at a bunch of different visas, and by the way, I had a lot of immigration lawyers call me and say, "Oh, no problem. We can solve that with an El Blah visa or this visa or that visa." And after I took about 20 of these calls, where every one of them ended with, "Oh no, your situation's unique," I stopped having those conversations because I realized I'd used enough of my allocation of them up. The most entertaining thing was that the number of lawyers who said, "It's not technically legal, but..." And whenever a lawyer says that, you just want to run screaming. Like which bar are you part of again? Who can I report you to? So the EB-5 visa is almost the opposite of what's interesting in the context of entrepreneurship. The way an EB-5 visa works is if you're a foreigner and you invest $1 million in a U.S. company, any kind of U.S. company, you get an EB-5 visa and can come to the U.S. So essentially, the cost of a visa for somebody that has $1 million is $1 million. You can buy a visa for $1 million. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff theoretically around that that's supposed to make it so that you're not just buying a visa, there's supposed to be job creation. And in some cases, these things exist. But what's happened, the EB-5 started in 1990, and what we've learned is that it's one of the most abused visas historically. There are these regional centers that get created to process them. And anybody in here part of the EB-5 lobby? Anybody in here own an EB-5 regional processing center? Just making sure I don't insult anybody in here. Here's how it works. Anybody want to make a quick $1 million? Good. Here's how you do it. You spend 2 years and you petition the government and you get chartered as an EB-5 regional processing center. You then market to foreign countries. For $1 million, you can get a visa and I'll process you. And for each of those people, you charge them $50,000. And all you got to do is process 20 of them and you made $1 million. That's all you got to do. Oh, you got to find a lawyer. Oh, he's got to pay the lawyer fees too and stuff like that. But that's what the EB-5 is. So there's parts of the EB-5 that are used for good. There's parts that are not. Regardless, it doesn't help the entrepreneur that's a foreigner who wants to come to the U.S. and start a company. You can't solve for that.
So the person who has the idea, but not necessarily the money themselves, right? They may be able to pull in
right.
VC money.
And interestingly, the vast majority of the EB-5s that have been allocated to foreign investors, it was not their company they were investing in. They were investing in a shopping center, a real estate project.
Yeah.
Catfish farms.
Catfish. Now, the good news was, and the rationale is decent, is it's real investment in this country. It's $1 million per deal, and that $1 million is coming into the U.S. But they're not high-growth companies. They're not major job creators, and they don't address sort of the category of people that are really going to be the high-growth job creators for the most part. Mm-hmm. What we've done with the EB-6, or the Startup Visa Act, is we basically say, let's just turn that around. Let's say we got 10,000 visas a year. By the way, the EB-5 visas, there's only 1,000, 2,000 of them used a year. I think the peak year was 4,000. So there's plenty that go unused, since you can't use them for the 8,700 Indians or 8,000 Indians. It'd be nice to allocate those 6,000, but they just vanish every year. Let's include this new EB-6 visa in that. And what you get is, if you're a foreign entrepreneur and a U.S. investor will invest at least $250,000 in your startup, you get a visa. And you can have up to 3 co-founders, so you'd have to raise $750,000 for 3 visas. It's a temporary visa for 2 years, so you get to start your company for 2 years, and it automatically gets renewed after 2 years if you've created 5 jobs and either raised an additional $1 million or generated $1 million of revenue.
But you ultimately, you are a legal permanent resident during that time, or you can have your legal permanent resident status revoked, say if your company doesn't do well?
No, you have 2 years. Right. So if your company fails, how many people here are entrepreneurs? Keep your hands up. How many of you have ever had a company fail? Come on, you're not an entrepreneur unless you failed at least once. For a guy that's an entrepreneur hasn't failed once, just lucky. And so how many people that have failed have tried and started another company? And how many of you waited, 5 years before you did that? You just failed, you dealt with it, and you went and started another company. But
even after the 2 years, so say you've started 5 companies in the 2 years, they all fail. At the end of the 2 years, you still have to go home.
Then you have to go home.
Yeah, okay.
So you have to prove that you're creating jobs and building sort of a lasting entrepreneurial dynamic. And that's the thesis behind it. The interesting thing is, and I'll finish sort of this piece of it, is it's one of those things where on the surface, it's very hard to, I've talked to hundreds of people about it, including a lot of people whose initial reaction was immigration is bad, or other people whose reaction is unless you can reform all of immigration, is nothing worthwhile. This is one of those edge cases that is very hard to argue against, and in the context of immigration is kind of irrelevant. What it's really about is job creation, because these are people, the immigrant is not taking a job from somebody else. These were companies that didn't exist in the first place, and they're going to create jobs in the U.S. immediately. So it's kind of this classic engine that then plays back to where Vivek started, which is so many of the people that are in this country want that. Now, the last thing I'd say is the value of this visa also is that you'd be able to switch from an H-1B visa to this visa, or you'd be able to switch from a student visa to this visa. And how many people are here working for a big company that want to start a company? A lot. How many people are here that are students, undergrad, masters, or PhD students that want to start a company? A lot. And this is another way for them to then get on a path to permanent residence.
So Vivek, how much of what Brad's describing would address the problems that you're seeing?
It addresses a small but important part of the problem. It still leaves out hundreds of thousands of workers who are working for companies who are going to leave and work for multinationals back home or do outsourcing back home. So there's still a huge, a brain drain going on. But what he's addressed is a small sliver of this thing which could create jobs here. Mm-hmm. And his ambitions are much less than than mine are for this side.
Yeah, and I would agree completely. So part of the group of entrepreneurs and investors that's circled around this notion, our goal, I think many of the people in this group, by the way, are immigrants, and the stories are unbelievable that you hear about how people managed to get their companies started while not working for their companies, while they stayed in school, and just the craziness around it. I think all of us view the broader problem as one where we've got to figure out a way to stop the problem that Vivek describes. The political reality of the broader immigration problem from an entrepreneur's perspective is overwhelming.
Yeah, it's not going to happen right now.
Right? And so then it becomes a case of, in 2010, is there something that can be done? I wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed with a guy from the Kauffman Foundation, Paul Kudrowski, and in our op-ed we said every college, in addition to this, every college graduate should get of course every college graduate should get a green card stapled to their diploma. But that's not what we're talking about. There's a couple of other people from the Kauffman Foundation wrote a more expansive op-ed, which is exactly right, which is we've got to focus on the job creators, period. And some of the job creators are students. Interestingly, many university professors or presidents are very supportive of this notion publicly that college students that graduate from the U.S. should be able to have a path to permanent residency. And it actually plays very nicely in also on the startup visa, because I think they're reacting and saying, we've been saying this for a while, nobody's paying any attention. Here's a thing where if people get this and understand how powerful it is, maybe we can start to make some progress against this broader vision.
Yeah, some progress is better than no progress. I've had several of my graduate students from Duke University, one of the premier engineering programs in the country, leave to start companies in other countries because they couldn't stay after they went to Singapore, Germany, Turkey, Austria, China. A couple went to India. Probably about a dozen or more companies that could have been started here, and they're doing very well back home. One of them employs several hundred people right now.
And is there a symbolic element to it as well, that it sort of sends the message that the United States is kind of, even if comprehensive immigration reform is not going to be forthcoming, that at least sort of immediately that we're moving in the right direction, sort of, hold on, things might happen, or is it?
It's a Band-Aid for Silicon Valley. I mean, really.
I don't think it's a Band-Aid for Silicon Valley. I think it's a Band-Aid for high-tech entrepreneurship, which I think...
Yeah, including this region. I mean, for high-tech regions.
I think one of the things, and I'm quick to say, one of the very first things that people said was, this is just for Silicon Valley. And in fact, the amount of support from the East Coast, Boston, New York, I think there's the amount of support from any burgeoning tech hub. One of the phenomena that you see, and I see it over and over again with Techstars, and I see it with some of the other investing I do, is that notwithstanding the brain drain and notwithstanding opportunities in other countries, America still is the place where everybody wants to start a company.
Absolutely.
And it's such a great, multi-hundred-year history of somebody coming here with nothing and creating great wealth in the first generation. By the fourth generation, the kids have pissed it all away. But that's part of the productive cycle of society. But the dynamic of that vision, I mean, and when I talk to 23-year-old entrepreneur applying to Techstars from all over the world, and I say, why are you applying here? Isn't there something in your... Oh, it's terrible to try to start a company in the Netherlands. It's so hard to start a company in blah. If I fail at my first company in blah, I'll never be able to start another company. Whereas here, if you fail, it's a badge of honor. So I think it's more than symbolic. It plays into one of the great strengths of the country, and it's so uplifting. I mean, when you see the success that somebody has made out of nothing,
absolutely,
especially when they've come here at age 20 or 25 or 30 from somewhere else in the world. Right. It's so powerful.
Lance, I'm going to have Lance and I this morning were talking about the reverse brain drain, and you sort of mentioned that there are ways in which it's not entirely a loss for the United States. And I wonder if you could.
There are two things there, but I wanted to give one quick example, however, on the EB-5, because I had a fairly young engineer come in who I think is at Google wanting to start a company. He's in the middle of his green card process, and he can't really leave Google while he's enmeshed in it. And he had a young Stanford graduate. I think you may actually know them. But the creative part of it was Google is sponsoring him, but he'll wait years in order to get his green card. But in the meantime, he invested $500,000 in the EB-5 program. This other program that already exists, which is really a limited partnership somewhere. It could be, I don't know what kind of legitimate business it is, and he will get his visa through that. And that is actually the linchpin that will allow him to move forward, leave Google, and start the company. This idea about the reverse brain drain, there are some benefits to it. And there was a study sponsored by the state of California that when people leave, they tend to maintain their ties to the U.S. And they create what I refer to as sort of traditional tribal trading patterns, as in the old days, where they would have people from their ethnicity in different parts of the world trading. And the study showed an extraordinary amount of financial benefit in terms of trade between California and India and China and so forth. So there are some benefits
from
there.
companies that sort of immigrants people who have been here in the United States and gone
left.
back home. But then
That study was in 1999 by Annalise Saxion, who I'm working with on updating all of our research. What was brain circulation has become brain hemorrhage now. It's come to the point right now it's a one-way street that there is some trade happening over here. But the magnitude of growth in China in particular is just mind-blowing to see how much is happening there. He talked about this 80-mile radius park. I mean, it's all, high-tech entrepreneurship we're talking about. So.
There's several challenges, Brad, that I wanted to sort of address that's embedded in both our law and the way in which it's enforced by our supposedly benefits part of immigration that really harm startups. One is we've got this backlog of numbers. So you have a number, 500,000 or so people who are in line to get green cards here. They can't afford not only to leave the company to start their own companies, but they can't leave these companies, Google, whomever they're working for, to actually go to work for one of your startups. Because your startups are too small and too risky. So you've got incredible vault of talent locked into these large companies when they should be out there as sort of satellites, creating new pockets of energy and innovation. In addition, there's an enormous bias with the Immigration Service about small companies. It's felt, and it's been really driven home by Senator Grassley of that high immigration state of wherever in the Midwest, that the H-1B program, which we referred to earlier, is just fraught with fraud. And therefore, a company that has less than 25 individuals, has less than 10 million in revenue, has been in existence for less than 10 years, will get a pushback from the service asking for all sorts of documentation to support the fact that it's an ongoing company. And they'll ask for things, since they don't understand business, that shouldn't even exist. For example, in Palo Alto, we don't need a business license to do business, but they'll ask for it, and they don't understand why you can't give it to them. They'll ask for your monthly wage reports for all your employees. Well, a lot of these companies, there are people working just for equity, the Americans, and they're not paying wages. So there are ways in which we have to sort of reform and instruct the service itself, and it has to come from a political perspective, to give the small companies a break. And that's just not the case at present.
So I agree, and I'll offer one insight that I've had in the last 6 months of playing around with this that was new to me. And I'm pretty politically tone deaf, and I don't really care that much about politics. So, I get to, we were in Washington a couple of weeks ago, and the little buzzer went off for them to call to take a vote. And I said, is a fire alarm going off? And they actually believed me that I was that much of a rube because I'd done such a good act. It is unambiguously clear to me at this point that the political superstructure of this country and of our states, not just at a federal level, but at a state level, I'm not sure at a local level, do not understand the difference between a small business and an entrepreneurial business. They just simply don't. And so when you talk about an entrepreneurial business, you get lumped into the same category that the corner dry cleaner gets lumped into, or the corner grocery store of our parents' generation gets lumped into. And it's pervasive. And when you explain what you're talking about, it's almost they don't understand, they don't comprehend, again, in the political infrastructure. And we see it in Colorado, and we've seen it recently in Colorado in terms of some of the tax dynamics where the cause and effect of this is lost. And so, the people that are administering the law versus the people that are trying to generate the policy are messed up. And I think that's part of why it's so important to be vocal about it. In that, it might have been the case that a decade ago or 15 years ago it was a pain in the ass, but other countries didn't have the sort of entrepreneurial growth and robust focus on it that they do today. The graph that says what people think is the future better, is your country's future ahead of it or behind it, and seeing Europe where everybody thinks it's behind or maybe it's the same, and then China and India where it's unambiguously ahead. That's part of what the U.S. is competing with. And I actually don't think it's bad. I think it's great that that's happening in those countries. I think that makes us have to rise with our game as a country, but we have to rise with our game, and that's the problem I think that we're all struggling with, is that nobody's focusing on that. They're saying, whatever, Keep those bad guys out. Those Canadians, they drink too much beer.
You know, I was going to say, Vivek, you know, we painted not a very rosy picture of where we're going and where our talent is going, or their talent is going back to. But there is a solution, partial solution to this, because many of these people actually would like to have a green card or like to have some foot in America. And if not for themselves, and I've seen this over and over, for their children, to have the opportunity to make it easier. If we were only to unleash the numbers, stop the quotas in a way. I mean, these 140,000 business-related immigrant visas, the green cards, every year, it's not just the individual employee who's being sponsored. It counts the spouse and the children. So that's not 140,000 of, educated, entrepreneurial engineering talent. It's the whole family. If they were to unleash those numbers and they were to make green cards readily available, even under the present system, so that you could get it in a predictable period of time, within 6 months, a year, it's not that they wouldn't go back eventually.
What happens is that we're like students. Most of my students, half of my students in the master's program, engineering program at Duke are foreign nationals. They all talk about going back after a few years and so. Once you stay in America for a few years, you get a job here, you fall in love, not only with a partner but with the country itself. It's very hard to go back. They don't go back. Mm-hmm. So what we've done is that we've created all these barriers right now to them even staying. So they can't even stay here to get a job. They can't get H-1B when they graduate. And if they do, they hear horror stories from others who've been on these visas for so long. Because one of the problems, one of the reasons why there's so much opposition to skilled immigrants is that the belief is that H-1B visas reduce the salaries of Americans. And the reality is that they do reduce the salary of Americans, because once you're working on an H-1B visa, if you started the process, you could be 10 years into it, waiting for your green card. In that 10-year period, you can't change jobs. You can't accept a promotion into a different job. You can't change companies without going to the end of the queue. Therefore, once you're into that thing, you'll do it. Any tech employer, in fact, any employer who knows their employee is not going to leave them, is not going to worry about giving them salary increases. They're not going to give them the same bonuses. They're not going to give them the same TLC that they give employees who they know are going to leave the next day. So therefore, you have a class of people who are, bonded in servitude for the companies they're working for.
I want to differ a little bit.
Right.
Okay.
That is a reality, whether we like it or not.
All right. One of the few improvements, I think, in approaches and process with the Immigration Service is something they call portability, and it basically allows an individual who's been in the green card process, meaning actually filed their adjustment of status the last stage for more than 6 months, can then carry it over to a new sponsoring employer. So there is some ability to move over, and
that's at the end, at the tail end, maybe.
At the very end. That's right.
But still, for years and years, you're stuck in limbo.
That's true.
And that's why I'm saying that you have about 500,000 workers stuck in limbo right now.
But I was going to say though that those who actually are, and I know we filed a ton, and everyone else did in 2007, this quota opened up magically and became current, and we all poured in. And of course, all they did, like a dam, it backed everything up years and years. So you've got probably hundreds of thousands of individuals who are in that process in a sort of backwash of time, changing from company to company. They're being picked off. I see it with our clients, readily from other companies and they're getting higher wages, and these perhaps more a minority, but they won't go to the startups. That's the other part of it.
Because it's too risky.
Because it's too risky,
yeah.
Right. So
the startup goes out of business, and then they're screwed. They have to go right back home, right, which works against the entire system. It's just what we're doing right now is lose.
Take it a step further. I actually think the H-1B problem in the context of moving from company to company and company to startup is a structural problem with the way the H-1B exists today. And it's been a structural problem for a long time. And it should be fixed, unambiguously should be fixed. I think the startup community has organized around that. And when I look at the startup community and I look at the people sort of in the startup community, there are, in situations where you have somebody that you really want to get from a Google or from a Yahoo or from a Microsoft, the startup always figures out how to do it. It's the same thing that happens on the venture side. If I really, 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 really badly want to invest in a foreign entrepreneur, I will figure out a way to make it happen, and if that foreign entrepreneur is willing to do it. So it's not that it's impossible. It's that the barrier to doing it is so high, the risk associated with it for any kind of foot fault destroying the whole process, sending you to the back of the line, kicking you out of the country, getting you stuck in Vancouver for 6 months while your family's here and everybody's afraid to move. People just say, screw it, it's not worth it. It's too much stress, right? It's too much risk. And I think that's the thing that societally we shouldn't, as Americans, we shouldn't accept, because it's just ridiculous. The second order effect is I think it does then create an inhibitor to innovation and entrepreneurship and economic growth, yes. Right? So interestingly, I think in the broader context, both of those things are pretty important. In the narrower context around innovation and entrepreneurship, I think there's a set of things that you can address, but there's a whole bunch that you're just not gonna until you address the whole system. Mm-hmm. And I think, there's a political will. Everybody espouses that after healthcare gets passed, there will be a political desire to take on something else. I think what that means is that they're all going to run for office again. I don't know. It's one of those things where, the theoretical construct that you want to change versus the practical reality of what are you dealing with now. I'm always going to land on the practical reality of what can you do in the short term that starts to make incremental change while keeping a view on the broader problem. And I think what we have, and what is reassuring to me whenever I talk to young entrepreneurs, is the heroic nature of entrepreneurship in the U.S. over the last 50 or 60 years, and the reputation that we've created over the last 50 or 60 years. It will decay if we don't do something, Absolutely. But it's not decaying in 12 months. It's going to take some time to decay. Mm-hmm. We're stupid if we let it decay. Right, and it's not a zero-sum game because that can be something that worldwide experience.
Can I ask a question to Lance? What if we set up a company like Techstars as a corporation here, and had the government had the state of Colorado put some money in it? It became a sanctuary for skilled immigrants. So that what happens is that they become employees of the entity, and they can start their companies within that entities. Would something like that be possible?
Not under current law, no.
Why?
Because in terms of one entity and then spawning off other.
It's not spawning off. Basically, that they get to start their companies within this entity.
Incubator, yeah.
Basically, I'm saying it's create a sanctuary for Silicon Valley skilled immigrants. All these people that are going back here, you want them here. If you can start another 200 companies here, I guarantee you the economy will boom like nothing else will. And what you're doing is that you're basically hiring them into an entity
yes.
which they're employees of. And once they get to a certain point, then maybe they spin off with the startup visa or whatever else. But in the meantime, they can come over here. You take out a billboard on 101 saying, give us your skilled immigrants, come to Boulder, Colorado. The weather is much nicer here. Yeah. The skiing is much nicer here.
You could do that as long as there was an employer-employee relationship, and they were, in a sense, managers of product lines, meaning that they were responsible for creating something, which happens with companies.
But maybe if you should think about it, get together as a community, and your goal is to bring 200 startup companies to Boulder. I'm telling you that the likelihood of you having a few major successes is huge, and get the government behind it. And like I said, take out the billboard on 101.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's two things having lived here for 15 years. One is there's no shortage of startup opportunities here. So I don't think that's a constraint. And the second is our state government's broke. So they don't have any money to give for something like that.
But then get some rich people who succeeded to do it. I mean, in Silicon Valley, the Indian community basically raised about $20 million for a center.
I don't see what the difference between doing it in Silicon Valley with a bunch of rich people and doing it in Boulder, Colorado with a bunch of rich people.
Because you have a vested interest in bringing people over here.
But you're still back to the backlogs.
You still have the same problem.
Yeah.
The problem doesn't change. I agree with the thesis, but so now you still can't hire the people.
Yeah.
Let me get to the backlog for one quick second, because there actually has to do with the government is broke. Because there is a self-interest of the immigration service here to keep the quota backlogged. Because as long as it's backlogged, these individuals have to continue to file for extension to the H-1Bs. They only live on the fees that they get from the services they provide. And I will tell you, if I had to choose between being in private practice and earning what the government earns in fees, I would quadruple my earnings. I mean, that's how much it's overweighted in terms of the costs on the government side to sponsor and employ. But they live off that. They're not given any other subsidy from the federal government. Mm-hmm. So they have a vested interest in not changing it as well.
Interestingly, and patents get talked about a lot here, and people know my views on patents. It's the same reverse incentive that exists, which is the government's incented to not make the system more efficient, to not make it to lower the thresholds because they get paid for keeping it inefficient. the PTO gets paid, the more patents that get filed and adjudicated, the more money the PTO gets for filing fees and for patent fees. So by definition, they want more to flow through the system. Even if, intellectually top down, they say, no, quality matters, da-da-da-da-da. That sort of weird incentive, and we saw it in Washington. We had interesting conversations with people where, you get somebody in a corner and you have a real conversation with them versus the conversation in the room. And it always pops up, they're quick to talk about how they can't get anything done. They're quick to talk about how there are all these problems in terms of the way things are structured today. And it's definitely, my exposure to the federal system is that there's an awful lot of culture of we can't do that. And that's the start of the conversation versus tell me how this would be a better thing.
Right. Another piece is also the familiarity. So we've been talking all about employment-based immigration, but one of the other ways people come here, the main other way people come here to as a legal permanent resident is family-based immigration. And that has backlogs like you cannot imagine, especially if you're from one of these countries from which we have a lot of immigration. So India, China, and then the Philippines in particular. So if I'm a U.S. citizen and I'm trying to sponsor my brother or sister from the Philippines, that person is facing over a 25-year wait to be able to come here, right? So that's sort of in some ways part of the touchstone for the government, which is, hey, it's not that bad in employment because look at what it looks like in family, right? So before I would turn to the questions in just a minute or two, but I just want to touch upon the political realities, right? So that's part of it. But I wonder if each of you maybe could just sort of identify what do you think is the main political hurdle to passing either the sort of more, Brad, you said it's sort of a no-brainer in terms of the startup, but maybe sort of put it in the larger context, which it's not just the startups, it's not just bringing the Canadian here, but it's allowing the Canadian to then hire, say, another Canadian to come work for them, either on the short-term basis, which is the H-1B, or the long-term basis, under employment-based immigration. So what do we need to do as a political matter to address this?
It's this issue of amnesty for illegals that everyone's worried about. Every time we talk about immigration, the discussion changes and everyone starts worrying about legalizing the illegals. And I think that's what the barrier is going to be.
Right. So because immigration just automatically kind of triggers that.
Immigration equals amnesty. Amnesty is bad.
Yeah.
And it's going to reward evil people for breaking our laws.
Right.
And therefore, we can't have it. That's what the argument goes.
To accomplish the business side and the benefits that flow from it, you've got to de-link what we're talking about today from the illegal immigration issue. Mm-hmm. That's just a firestorm to get into. Mm-hmm. It's hard enough trying to make the argument that immigration benefits the U.S. on the business side,
right,
that the talent is here and we're losing the talent. So, and then to link it to people who shouldn't be here, it becomes an impossible task.
So comprehensive immigration reform is a sort of strategic mistake for the business community.
No.
Yeah,
I strongly agree with both things that were said. I think that it degenerates so quickly. Let me tell you a conversation I had with somebody. One of the lobbyists that I met in D.C., who I didn't realize I was going to meet because he showed up at a meeting that we were having and sat in the corner of the room. And at the end of the meeting, I went up to him because I wanted to make sure I knew everybody that was in the room, and he hadn't said anything. I asked him who he was, and he sort of mumbled his name, and I asked him what he did, and he sort of mumbled what he did, blah, 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 for fair, blah, blah, this. And I said, well, what do you actually do? And he said, well, I represent, that being the word for lobby, I represent a nonprofit. And I said, well, what's a nonprofit? Is it a trade association? Do they, shelter the homeless? What do they do? And he says, well, it's actually the nonprofit that represents all the EB5 regional center owners. And I said, oh, that's nice. Great to meet you. That's exciting. Da-da-da-da-da. Isn't this neat? And he's like, well, no, your thing has a lot of problems. And I said, well, what are the problems? And he didn't say anything. And I said, look, I'm very interested in hearing the problems. Will you tell me the problems? We're on the same team. We're trying to get more foreign entrepreneurs, investors into the U.S. to create more jobs. What's the issue? He says, well, we don't like the fact that you're sharing our visa quota. And I said, well, what do you mean? You don't use your visa quota. But we're using more this year. So, even at that very narrow detail level, there is some dude who gets paid $100,000 a year to sit in the back of the room and make sure nothing happens.
All right, so why don't we take that moment now to open up to the audience. And the tradition at Silicon Flatirons is that students always get to ask at least the first question. So what student has a question they want to ask our panelists? Yes, yeah, Becca. And sorry, wait for the microphone to come, sir.
So I have really high hopes for the startup visa, and I'm really proud that Colorado is playing a prominent role in really pushing it forward. My question is, what are your thoughts or proposals with respect to how we should govern or administrate either the modified EB5 or the E6 or EB6 that Brad mentioned, given the inefficiencies that presently and historically have characterized the U.S. immigration system?
So I can try to take a crack at that based on what I've heard, including heard from some people on the sort of the U.S. Immigration Service side. The perception is that these are actually not that hard to administer. The EB-5 as a category and that type of visa is not that hard to administer and adjudicate. The problem with it is that the structure of it historically has led to a lot of shaky stuff. That the flip side of it is the notion of a qualified investor, which is who has to be involved in this. There's a pretty meaningful threshold. It's a multi-year threshold. So if you're an angel investor, you have to have made 2 investments a year for the preceding 3 years to qualify as somebody who, creates a valid situation. If you're a venture investor, you have to have invested for at least the 2 previous years, at least $2 million, $1 million in each investment. So you don't have this high burden, but you have a burden that weeds out all the, I show up and he's my cousin who's in school and I wire some money to some, it gets rid of all of those situations. And when you talk them through with the people that have to administer, they say, yeah, that doesn't seem that hard. So I'm optimistic based on the feedback that we've sort of worked through at least the first layer of that. I think the harder problem long term, if the one thing that everybody sort of circles around on, which Claire picked up on right away, is what happens if the company fails? Like how do you deal with that? And I think the entrepreneurs that we've talked to who are foreigners who have been potential candidates say, I'll take that risk. Mm-hmm. That's a risk I'll take. That's an okay risk because I got to prove myself.
I'd like to add to that, actually, sort of bringing the two of you together, because what we're talking about now, and a lot of the individuals I think you're probably dealing with are probably Indian or Chinese, more likely. Indian, not all. I know you've got Canadians and French.
It's actually a surprising number of Europeans, because in Europe, the entrepreneurial ecosystem is much weaker, especially at the early stages, and the Europeans love to come here. So I'm seeing a surprising number of European entrepreneurs who want to be in the U.S. because they just feel stuck in London and Berlin and whatever. Plenty of Chinese, plenty of Indians, but there
are fewer opportunities in Europe than there are in China right now.
Yeah. But my point was these are individuals who I think, unlike the previous generation, don't mind going back at some point as long as they have an opportunity here. It's not as if they've escaped jail to come here, and that was my point. I was actually. Because we see a lot more of it, obviously, in Silicon Valley. So there's a lot more elasticity, I think, in the ability of the individuals to take the risk. And then if it fails here, to go back and take the experience. As you all know, its experience is worth more than oftentimes the company with them and make it go somewhere else.
So I try to learn one thing every time I do something. And I just learned my one thing that I hadn't thought of before, which is that the answer to the question is that these younger entrepreneurs that are trying to start up companies are willing to take the risk because going back to India or China does not mean they're going to get killed.
Yes.
Or does not mean they're going to have no opportunity and have to do something that they don't want to do. Right. They want the opportunity, but they're willing to take the risk that they don't succeed because it's not the end of their... I hadn't thought of that before. Yeah. It's a good insight. Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, okay.
Hi. So I founded a VC-funded startup which got
Can you speak a little louder? It's hard to hear you.
Louder. Hi. I founded a VC-funded startup which got a fair amount of money, and I was based in London, and the company got invested in London, and then we opened an office in Menlo Park, and then I got an L1 intercompany transfer visa over to the US as a sort of what I would think of as a hack, right?
That's one of the hacks. It's a good hack.
Right, and then now I'm the other hack I'm also doing is I'm now happily engaged to an American. So my question is...
happily is the key that you got to mention.
Yeah, very, very happily, actually,
okay,
and in Denver, too.
Is she happy or are you happy?
That's not
I'll take that you're happy for us.
That's not a hack, that's a gift and a blessing.
Thank you. So my question is, what are the other hacks and how prevalent are they?
So the other hacks that I'm aware of, there's a category that I'm not going to bother that are the illegal ones. Okay,
and I wouldn't know them. So.
You wouldn't know them. But I will tell you that any immigration lawyer, except for Lance, that's been practicing immigration law for a long time, has a set of illegal hacks. The problem is that they're very specific in terms of what they're tuned to, and most of them are a function of paperwork getting messed up or filing the wrong paperwork for a certain thing. The other hacks that are legal all have to do with the first dynamic that you described that I'm aware of, which is the initial company is domiciled somewhere else, it's funded somewhere else, it then opens a U.S. office, and after 12 months, it's much easier to have people flow back and forth between those offices. The other legal hack is that the entrepreneur owns more than 50% of the company. And there's a couple of exemptions if the entrepreneur, the person getting the visa is a majority owner of the company. Those are the two that come up over and over again, and they work a very small percentage of the time. The third hack is the school hack, which is, and Manu Kumar, who runs a venture firm called K9, has had 2 successful startups, is in the Bay Area. You know Manu, right? Great guy, fantastic story of how he started and built 2 successful companies that he was never employed by. And he was the largest shareholder in one, and I think the VCs collectively own more than him in the other. He never took a salary, never worked for the company. He was a master's student the entire time at CMU for the first one, a PhD student at Stanford for the second. And that's a legal hack. You can do that.
Because you can be a member of the board. You can't be a day-to-day operations. You can invest the money or the ideas, contribute, get a percentage of it. But as long as you're not providing, quote, productive work for it, you can contribute your intellectual property, it's not a problem. But
don't be confused. He worked most of his time for the company.
I didn't hear.
He didn't hear that, right? but that's the hack, right? I mean, he had a real role at a university. That was a professor who was willing to sponsor him, but the work that he spent most of his time on was.
It has become more difficult. It used to be you actually could have a clear definition, a clear distinction between the company entity and the employee, and you could have your quote founder employed by the company and still be considered an employee, with others, the garnishment around it, some other employees and so forth. Immigration has now taken a much harder view of that, and they don't see the distinction when you've got a founder involved, and so that's practically closed to most entrepreneurs at the moment. But the idea of starting a company abroad and then coming here, we see a lot. It's actually a very sort of natural progression, and then we see what happens is the company gets flipped. And the U.S. company becomes essentially the parent company because at some point you want to sell it or list it. In the old days, you still want to list it. So
the solution for one of the Techstars companies was the 2 Europeans are both in Europe right now. They had a third partner join them who was an American. They raised about $1.5 million, a little bit less. They're based here. They have a couple of people in Europe. Most of the employees are here, and they're in the process now of getting queued up, so a year and a day they'll come here on an L visa.
All right, we can take one more question. So what else? Yes, down here in the front. Just hang on 1 second for the...
And the distressing thing is I know way more about this than I ever thought I'd know about it, and as far as I can tell, it's of no real value to me.
Well,
Yes, sir.
that brings my question about the value to this community of Boulder, and thank you all for all of the contributions in this discussion. It occurs to me as an entrepreneur and service provider to startups and young companies of all kinds that perhaps, Lance, on your next trip to the Techstars city in Beijing, that perhaps Brad, myself, and some others could go and offer, in other words, a kind of a reverse outsourcing where we have an abundance of startup opportunities in Boulder, but there are a lot more service providers in Boulder that have entrepreneurial instincts to grow their businesses. And I worked in the late 90s with several Israeli companies that had incredible technology and absolute stupidity about how to reach this marketplace and how to position it, name it, talk to customers. And so an inordinate amount of failures, and I'm sure that of the 22-something thousand companies in this place, that there could be the translators, the strategic alliance developers, the people who, like Mark and myself, are here in Boulder. I think there are dozens and dozens of us that are underemployed.
Let me just quickly respond to that, and that is sort of twofold. One, I think you may have read in the paper today that Applied Materials has just opened up a major R&D center in China. That's a very big step. Applied was known in the Valley as the most innovative international firm because it was the first to break through Japan. with James Morgan, to really go after where the semiconductor manufacturers were and selling the equipment. But the real change now, and I think Vivek has sort of vividly pointed out, the market isn't here anymore. Z-Park does have a representative in Palo Alto, but the market is there. Most of the companies that have been created in these countries now are actually aimed at domestic market, and they're geared towards that market. They actually have no interest in America, quite frankly. Is that close?
It's happening increasingly, yes. Yeah. It's a big problem for us. So far, we've assumed that we're the only kings. The world has changed.
Okay, good. All right. Well, Vivek, Lance, and Brad, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate that.
So before we start the second panel, I want to acknowledge someone who's made really extraordinary contributions here at CU Law, Silicon Flatirons, the campus, and really the Mile High Tech community overall. Julie Penner, where's Julie? If you want to come on up, Julie. I'm going to say a few nice things, hopefully embarrass you. Has really made deep contributions across campus. Her involvement includes being a critical organizer since the start of the New Tech Meetup. So for those of you who have been to a New Tech Meetup, you know that is really a nerve center for the technology community here in the Boulder, Denver area. And Julie has been organizing that pro bono for over 2 years now. She helped launch the New Venture Challenge last year, and then this year stepped up more or less as the social media czar. And social media appears to be a burgeoning interest and expertise area for Julie, as she's being increasingly asked to do speaking engagements around social media, and delighted to have her doing that. She examines potential angel deals for a local investor. She has worked for Vista Ventures over the last year. She assists entrepreneurs as a student attorney in the Entrepreneurial Law Clinic. And Julie is potentially closing in on a job, but it's not done, so hire her now before it's too late. This award recognizes the graduating student at CU Boulder who has made the greatest contribution in serving and improving the entrepreneurial community during his or her time on campus. I am delighted to award that to Julie Penner. Second panel. I want to thank many people who are here who have helped put this second panel together, including John Ives. I think John is here. If you raise your hand. Juan Rodriguez, Dave Magnum, I mentioned, put together some updates to what we're going to see. And the person who had the vision and generosity to share this is Kyle Lefkoff. I want to introduce Kyle. He's going to sharpen up some issues for the panel that we get going. Kyle is a founder and general partner of Boulder Ventures, Boulder, Colorado-based VC fund with over $300 million in committed capital in 5 separate partnerships. 23-year career as a VC, and Kyle has invested in 58 Colorado companies, resulting in 12 IPOs and 15 trade sales. Please help me in welcoming Kyle Lefkoff.
How do I drive? Just forward? Do it arrow. Yeah. So, in the 25-year history of Colorado Venture Management and its successor fund, Boulder Ventures, we've made investments in 3 key industries in Boulder, Colorado, for which there now exists a family tree. That's natural foods retailing, life sciences, mostly pharmaceutical business, and data storage. And because we focus all of our investment activities on serial entrepreneurs here in Boulder, Colorado, it dawned on us at some point in the late 90s that the lineage of these things was important and how they were connected to each other and where they came from. And so I'll talk a little bit about the data storage family tree, but just so you know that it exists, the same tree exists for natural foods retailing and for life sciences. And many of the lessons from the family tree, which is what I'm going to introduce here, are also prevalent in those 2 places. So it's interesting that it doesn't matter that those diverse industries, all 3 of which are pillars of the community here and commerce in Boulder, teach us the same things. These are the key lessons from the data storage tree. First, location matters, and that's the point of this panel today. So we're going to speak a lot about why people come here and why they stay. But the fact is, empirically, they do for some obvious reasons. Second, anchor tenants are key assets. Storage Tech and IBM were the anchor tenants in data storage here in Boulder from the 1960s and 1970s. And having an anchor tenant, an important local company who has achieved significant commercial success in its marketplace, is a key success factor for any community in the entrepreneurial setting. It's the origins of all the follow-on companies that come. Juan and Jesse's success at Storage Tech begat an entire family of rotating media and tape storage companies here in Boulder, which led to great success. Our investment in 1985 in a Storage Tech spinoff, McData, was the origins of the storage networking business here in Boulder, of which Left Hand Networks that my colleague John Spire started was a key example of the success there. So all these companies stayed. They're all important companies, even though they've changed hands over time and have all experienced their rises and falls. So the lesson there is that anchor tenants are key assets to a community. I'll just note that in the life sciences business, the University of Colorado is the anchor tenant. All of the life sciences companies in our family tree in Boulder, and we count about the same number, sort of an N of around 50, all have origins in the University of Colorado, much like the origins here are Storage Tech and IBM. And in the natural foods retailing business, the origins are all Celestial Seasoning. So the anchor tenant's really a key feature. What we invested in Boulder Ventures are serial entrepreneurs, and they are the scarce resource in each of these family trees. What's interesting in each of the trees is that while the N is 50 or more companies, the number of companies in the tree approximates 50 or more over the 30 or 40 year life cycle of post-war commerce in Boulder, Colorado, the number of identifiable serial entrepreneurs is dramatically less. And in fact, all of the trees in each of these industries, data storage among them, can chart their histories and origins and most important successes to half a dozen serial entrepreneurs. And so it is our thesis in venture capital that it is the job of us as venture capitalists to identify those key serial entrepreneurs and focus our energies on them. And that's been true certainly in the data storage family tree. And we'll talk about that, I hope, in the context of place in attracting and retaining those key serial entrepreneurs, two of whom are in the room here, Juan and Jesse, to succeed in the data storage industry here. In the case of the data storage family tree, CU is a source of talent, of expertise, of technology, and there has been a meaningful amount of technology transfer from CU to the local data storage industry, mostly through the intellectual property of the students trained here and who've received their undergraduate and graduate degrees here. That is different than the life sciences family tree, where CU is the origins of the intellectual property in the form of patents and actual discoveries that have formed the basis of the pharmaceutical industry here in Boulder. So it's perhaps not as prevalent as it is, but CU plays a really important and very meaningful role in the family tree in data storage, and we can talk about that as an important part of place. No entrepreneurial community in the United States exists without a major research university. It's a fact of life. You have to have that as an essential ingredient. It is interesting, though, that the natural foods retailing family tree, CU had nothing to do with. So it's just an artifact of the growth of that industry in Boulder that, in fact, place is more important to the natural foods industry than the meaningfulness of CU as it is to data storage and these other things. Finally, it was fascinating to me this last panel discussion that Brad participated on, because state and local governments are irrelevant to the growth and success of any of the businesses that have sprouted in Boulder. They can only be impediments to our local entrepreneurial economy. I give this speech a lot, this part of the speech a lot in public forums with state and local government officials, and the message is always the same, and it doesn't matter if it's the storage tree or the life sciences tree. The only thing the state of Colorado can do to benefit the business community of Boulder is to invest in the University of Colorado. That's the only thing that they can do. Anything else they do is utterly irrelevant and probably has some secondary effects that overwhelm whatever good they were attempting to achieve. Right? Leave us alone, please, is our message to the state and local government, except when it comes to the University of Colorado. it is astonishing to me that as a place, the University of Colorado derives 6% of its budget, I think, this year from the state of Colorado. And I estimate that Bruce Benson spends approximately 80% of his time at the state capitol lobbying people for that 6% of the budget. So I'm here to tell you that one of the lessons data storage and life sciences is that CU is a very important part of the local ecosystem, and that state and local governments are not, and that the only thing that they could do is mess it up, so please invest more money in the University of Colorado. So back to the subject of place. We all know why we're here in Boulder, Colorado, and either you get it or you don't. It's a really interesting phenomenon to me that there's this pretty fundamental disconnect between people who live in Boulder in the entrepreneurial community as opposed to state and local governments or the university or pursue their careers or don't work, of which there's a lot of people in Boulder, that as opposed to their entrepreneurial peers in San Francisco or in Boston, two other key centers which share many of the same attributes, that we have a similar conversation about the interests in life sciences or data storage or computer networking. We have very common views. The ecosystems are similar in many respects, except that people in Boulder get why they are here as a place, and people in Boston and Silicon Valley do not get why we are here as a place. And there's no way to explain to someone in Silicon Valley the metaphor of the face shot, which is what I'm demonstrating here. Face shots are metaphors for why we are in Boulder. All of us are here because of this physical epiphany of living in this place. And we don't have to explain that to anyone else in Boulder. So we're not going to talk about it here, but I just want to note it, that it is the essential thing. I'm a climber. I can't live anywhere else and go climbing every day and still have a real job. So I don't want to live in Boston or San Francisco. But I can't explain that to somebody whose sole and only purpose in life is to make money, because they should be somewhere else other than Boulder. So there's a fundamental disconnect, and this is my slide on place, which is the metaphor of the face shot. With that, I will turn it over to Brad for a panel discussion.
Terrific. Let me introduce the other panelists, and before doing it, in terms of the chart that was made, I want to thank Matt Emmy and Poster Brain and One Button for making copies of those and making those available to us. Panelists here, it's a great panel, and I think this is a story that really has needed to be told about this area for some time, and hard to imagine someone better than Jesse Owita, who is the founder of Storage Tech. And Juan, if you could raise your hand, was a co-founder at Storage Tech with Jesse, is regarded as really the father of computer data storage industry in Colorado. He was the chairman and president of Storage Tech, where he founded in 1969, built it into a billion-dollar company over 12 years, and many of the data storage and technology-related companies in Boulder County are directly descended from that line. Since leaving Storage Tech, Jesse's been involved in the financing and startup of several of these companies, both individually and as a general partner of Owita Venture Partners. Jim Linfield has been involved from the legal perspective along the way, and he is a partner at Cooley, Godward, and Cronish. Jim is the partner in charge. I assume that means that you're the boss of the Boulder Broomfield office, I should say. Joined the firm in 1993. His practice focuses on representation of public and private technology companies, including many of those in the data storage space. John Spires is the founder of Left Hand Networks. John's been pioneering technology in the storage industry for 25 years now. He founded venture-backed Left Hand Networks in November of 1999 in Longmont, Colorado. And over a coffee, I guess last November, I found out that it really is named after the brewery. Mm-hmm. An homage to the brewery, which for those of you who are Sawtooth fans, you'll appreciate that. Developed virtualized scale-out storage architecture. Left Hand had a very happy exit to Hewlett-Packard November of 2008, and really delighted to have this panel together. I'm going to start with Jesse. And Jesse, if we can wind back to 1969, you co-found Storage Tech with Juan, Tom, and Zoltan. What factors made this the right place looking back? Do you agree with that framework that Kyle laid out in terms of what made this the right place for storage industry? Jesse?
Well, in a way, but let me talk about it slightly from a different point of view. We came here working for IBM. And IBM is a base company that started storage in this area. But in reality, we didn't come in here because we wanted to move to Boulder. We came here because our job moved to Boulder. But after we moved to here from Poughkeepsie, New York, and I should add, but let me backtrack a little bit. Of the four founders of Storage Tech, Juan, myself, and Zol Herger, going back to the panel we just had a little while ago, we all came from different countries. I'm from Palestine, from Cuba, Zol Herger from Hungary, and Tom Capita was, I guess, the lone American born here with a bunch. So anyway, it seems like whatever we talked about before kind of fits here. So we came to develop storage products, and the point, I think, that made this kind of chart be what it is the fact that storage turned out to be a very successful company. And with success, and I'm talking about a company in the third year of being in business, it had revenues of, I should say that after 2 years of business, $4 million. The year after that was 24, was 65 after that, 125 after that. So it grew very rapidly. When a company grows rapidly like that, you need people. And we had to go all over the country, and in many cases outside the country, to attract people to come here. And that's where having a university like CU in here was very beneficial. Having the mountains and the skiing and what have you is absolutely a big seller. So we're able to attract a lot of people to come into this area. And who actually will come to a startup, very fast-growing startup, people who like to do something new and different. And we had a lot of that. A lot of people came to join Storage Tech over those early years who were very much entrepreneurs in their own rights. I mean, they talk about it, actually when you discuss things with them, they're thinking about, hey, I could have done the same thing myself. I will do the same thing myself. And in a way, we actually encourage people to do that also themselves. There are many cases, I know people came to see me, they have an idea, they said, the job I was working on is coming to an end, I'm thinking about going out to do something on my own. Say, hey, go ahead and do it. Good luck to you. And in some cases, we even invested in those companies. And by the way, we talk about technology, but a lot of the people one thing else I should add, and that is Storage Tech is a homegrown company for the Boulder Valley here, but at the same time, it grew as a whole company, not as a division of somebody else. It's a startup that became very large based in this area here. So we had talent in engineering, in finance, in marketing, in all kinds of disciplines, so that when people looked at things to do in this area that looked attractive to them, they actually got the idea, maybe I can go out and do it. Again, I'm talking about it was a good company for people who have good ideas to join, to grow. But as we all know, I think somebody asked a question before in the last panel, how many people started a company and they decided to go to, for whatever reason, it did not work out, it went to a second startup, a third startup. But in corporations like Storage Tech, a lot of people got a job in a certain program. When that program was completed, now they're more or less out of a job, they can look at something else to do within the same company, or maybe I can go outside and do it. And that happened a lot while the company was still growing. Storage Tech, as you all know, had its ups and downs after the fast, rapid growth. And so also there are opportunities for people to say, hey, I'm going to go out and do my own thing. And a lot of people did that. And many of those companies became very successful in this area right here. Now, I would say growing the company in Boulder Valley, it wasn't easy, but it happened because of the location. We were able to attract very talented people from all over the place. Now, we always used, Kyle talked about the fact, had the state of Colorado give money to CU and sponsor CU. We felt the same way about telling people about, hey, we have CU right here. Look what you can do with this university right here in your backyard. You take classes, you can do this, you can do that, and so on. And obviously, everybody became a skier. Whether they were good or bad, but they became skiers. They love the area here. So I think in a nutshell, if I take a look at, why is it that storage became very popular and expanded so much in this area, I'll still repeat, is because storage became successful. We brought in a lot of people from all over the country who are entrepreneurs in their own mind. They're not working at a company where they want to stay there until retirement, which is very often the case if you're joining like a GE or this or that. They came in to a small company growing. They want to grow with it or grow outside of it when the right time comes. And that did happen. So I would say it was the right vehicle, maybe looking back at it, resulting in large number of companies in this area were a result of having that initial job as storage tech.
So I want to pick up on a thread that you highlighted, that not only were people spinning companies out of storage tech, but in some respects you were encouraging that. And I want to loop that to John, your experience. I mean, has that been your experience in terms of storage entrepreneurs here? And as you started Left Hand, was there support from the community? Talk about that aspect. And then Jim, I'd like to turn to the policy aspects of that and maybe some of the non-compete law in Colorado. John?
Yeah, definitely. Looking back where I got my start at a company called Miniscribe, who was the company was founded by Terry Johnson, who had worked at Storage Tech, right? And he started in his garage there down in Longmont and developed the first Winchester disk drive, one of the first Winchester disk drives. There's still an argument over whether it was Seagate or Terry, but I went to work for Miniscribe when they were developing a 10 megabyte Winchester disk drive. And we used to sell that for the IBM PCXT. If you remember, the first IBM personal computers had dual floppy drives, and then they introduced a IBM PCXT that had the 10 megabyte hard drive. And I was on that team working on that 10 megabyte hard drive. And we used to sit around and argue whether or not anybody would use that much storage. And we were developing a 10 megabyte or 20 megabyte hard drive, and nobody will ever use 20 megabytes, and so on and so on. But yeah, through that experience, of course, Miniscribe was acquired by Magstore, and I actually was in that fray, and I got to know John Squires as well, who his name is very similar to mine, and I used to get his phone calls, so I kind of knew what he was up to. He actually started Connor Peripherals with Finis Connor, and he was just a lowly firmware engineer at Miniscribe, and he had this great idea for adaptive read channel technology, and the drive would adapt itself based on the mechanical stack-up tolerances, and the net result was much higher yields and a much more cost-effective product. And, of course, people looked at him like, well, you're not the guy to really tell us what product to develop next. And so he met up with Finis and started Connor Peripherals, and it was the second company in the history of America to do $100 million in revenue the first year. Compaq was the first. And Compaq just happened to be their main customer as well, which is kind of ironic. But again, the disk drive industry, all came, all sprouted from storage tech and the technology. And like Jesse said, those companies would hire a bunch of people, and the skill set and the training of those people would lead to more storage companies and more disk drive companies and more technology advancement. And I guess what kept the people here was, certainly the lifestyle, but also the fact that there were these companies doing storage, and they had skill sets in storage and could apply those skill sets to these newer companies. And CU, of course, on that theme was a great help to Left Hand Networks. They actually made an investment in Left Hand Networks, a small investment, but it was still an investment. And I would say 25 of the employees were from CU. There were also a handful from CSU. A lot of people forget there's another university up the street there. But similar story and great people there. And actually, two of Left Hand founders were immigrants back on the previous theme, were Polish immigrants. Actually, Zbigniew Sobolewski was thrown in jail during the Solidarity movement and got asylum in the United States. And he was the key developer of Left Hand's first product, the NS100, and also the NSM200 product. So, so there's that ties into that theme as well, I guess.
Well, let me ask in terms of culture, just a quick follow-up. When you or other entrepreneurs would leave a company to start a data storage play in the area, was there a general cultural norm that, good for you, John, take the swing, let me help invest and get you started? Or was it, you know what, you're now a competitor of mine, or you've left me? Was there a prevailing norm along those lines?
It was really the first. I don't think Storage Tech went after anybody that you're doing the wrong thing, we're going to sue you, we're going to go after you. We didn't do that to anybody. But in some cases, we had a chit-chat and talk to some people. They should not be taking any trade secret out with them. Use your mind, use your brains, do what you want to do, but don't take something we have and take it there. And it always worked. I mean, discussion worked.
Yeah, my experience. So we came up with the vision for Left Hand Networks when we were working at Maxtor's Network Systems Group in Milpitas, and Kelly and I and a couple of the other guys would have to commute out there. We'd leave Monday morning, come back Friday night. A lot of nights in the Holiday Inn talking about, these guys really screwed up. This isn't the way to do it, but I think Maxtor was kind of blindsided by us starting this company and this network storage group that they had formed. So Maxtor was in the disk drive business, and they had a vision towards getting into the network attached storage business because they could pack a bunch of disk drives in no box and charge more money for it. But there was more to it than that, obviously. But that's the way they went about it, which ultimately led to the failure of that group. We ran a software team, a small software team within that group, and we weren't really seen as the guys that knew the future or had a vision towards the future. And when they found out about what we were doing, they were very supportive. My previous boss and other people previous. We still had to indemnify our investors, of course, for just to check those boxes. But it worked out well, and there were no legal action. I mean, there's always a gray area of how much did they learn at the previous company that they applied to the new company, and it's a sticky subject, and you probably have a whole panel discussion just on that. But
or at least we've got Jim on our panel to help discuss some of the legal. And Jim, I want to drill down on that. Maybe you could talk a little bit about non-compete law in Colorado. Do you think that played a role in allowing mobility across companies, and how does that intersect with the cultural aspects that have already been addressed?
So just as a quick primer, in Colorado, by statute, a non-compete is enforceable if it's reasonable against executive management and professional staff to executive management. But basically it's not enforceable as to individual contributors, engineers, salespeople, and so forth. Obviously trade secrets are a separate issue, and those are protectable here. And that's a little bit of a difference from California, where basically non-competes are just verboten, just plain and simple, unless it's instant to the sale of a business. So, they are, within those parameters enforceable here. I would say over the last, 30 years that I've been doing this, I can think of very, very few instances where a non-compete prevented somebody from leaving, from moving from one company to another. In a lot of cases, it's because they're not going to be directly competitive. So when Terry left Storage Tech to make a 5 1/4-inch disk drive, Storage Tech wasn't doing 5 1/4-inch disk drives at the time, right? So it was not direct. Yes, you're competing for storing data, but you're not competing, head-to-head on the same product. The other limitation with a non-compete is it's really hard to have somebody work for you that doesn't want to work for you, And so, you can make their life miserable, but, what have you really accomplished? So I would say it's not been a big impediment. Back to Miniscribe, as a young pup in 1980, actually Miniscribe was one of my first clients. And I remember sitting with Terry, and we were talking about his plans to hire people out of Storage Tech. And he said, I think I can hire people at about this rate, like one every 2 months, without pissing Jesse off. So he was very cognizant of...
He probably knew it, because it's a fact. We somehow did nothing if they took 1 or 2 or 3. But more than that, we call him up and say, hey, you got to lay off. Right.
So somehow or another, he kind of knew what the limit was, and he was pretty careful about that.
That's funny.
Terry, they've talked about Terry Johnson. He was one of the guys who lived early on at Storage Tech. He was developing a product. He was working on it. It was a small tape subsystem. And somehow we decided that we really don't want to be in that market. So we're going to kill that product. He said, boy, you guys are going to kill that product. I'm going to leave and do my own thing. That's exactly what happened.
So what is it about these storage tech guys and the cars, right? Because Terry was like the first guy in Boulder to have a Ferrari Testarossa. Remember that white one he used to drive up and down, right? And then Volk was another one of your guys, Juan, right? And that guy owns more Cobras than anybody in the world. Has his museum out in Iowa. Was there some car thing going on with inside storage tech?
Right? Juan and I drive just old American cars.
We've got the same problem with CU law professors. Professor Allen is rocking the Lamborghini on a regular basis. So, Kyle, I want to pull you into this in terms of spillovers, and that's ultimately what we're talking about, where you're talking about someone who takes the expertise that in some respects has been learned from one organization, spills it into another. I can think of that working along two dimensions. One is the entrepreneur who starts the new entity. The other is the innovation process, the engineers who have the ideas. And I'm wondering if you could maybe highlight how you've seen the spillover between companies in this industry along both dimensions.
I'll address it from a social aspect, which is that in Boulder, unlike in Silicon Valley and Boston, in the high-tech worlds, where everything is top secret amongst your little silo. In Boulder, we all the large companies, the small companies, the entrepreneurs, and the venture capitals are all very open with each other about what's going on and what they're doing. And there's a high premium in our community to not pissing each other off for better or for worse. It's a small town. And so I think in creating data storage companies generally, whether they're networking or rotating media or tape drive companies, that we as a community work hard to make sure that we're not stepping on each other's toes and not in those spillovers or spin-offs is what we would call them, not spillover, but the spin-off companies are in a sense blessed by the progenitor companies, and that the people come from places and it's a good idea and everybody agrees it's a good idea and it's not competitive and we're not going to get a step on each other's toes. Don't you think it's true? I mean, nobody's ever sued anybody.
That's true. And I also, if you look at that chart back there, probably more than half are in things not quite the main business of storage tech per se, which is building storage devices, disk drives, and libraries. Some of them are in the leasing business. Mm-hmm. Some went into small disk drives. I mean, there are different fields. Some marketing companies and so on that, good luck to them. Go ahead and do it.
And that's a very good point, Jesse. One of the criticisms of the family tree I got when we published it the first time, 4 or 5 years ago, was that it doesn't capture all of the businesses that were created as a result of the success of the storage industry here. In other words, all the cable and wire harness businesses and all the metal benders up in Longmont making casings and what's her name who did the PR and went on to her Sherry Leopard, right? Yeah. Had IBM's PR business. All these people and the lawyers. I mean, there's law firms, succeeded as a result of data storage. That all this ecosystem that grows up around the actual companies that produce the product are arguably as important to the community and to the kind of effects of place that you're talking about as are the companies themselves. Because it's impossible to keep it going without that ecosystem around you.
So there's an academic term for this, agglomeration economies, which is obviously hard for me to say. And Jim, in terms of the first deal that you did related to storage industry, do you remember which one it was?
Yeah, it was Miniscribe, and it was Terry raised his first round of venture money. Actually, he raised a little bit of seed money here from a couple of guys in Denver, Bruce B. and Wade Kennedy. Mm-hmm. But his first venture money came from J.H. Whitney and Alan Patrikoff in New York, and I remember working on that one. It must have been 1981.
And can you talk about the efficiencies or inefficiencies associated with doing the first deal as opposed to once you started to see repeat deals that started to look like each other as it went along?
Well, I remember this one was difficult because it was a New York counsel on the other side. Ironically, a firm that Cooley merged with, the Kroner-Schlieb firm, was on the other side of this way back when, and they were representing the Lauder family, which was one of the investors that came in, and it was for a $2 million deal or whatever it was a big project for them. So that was pretty inefficient. But as you get through, once you set the basic template for a venture round, the successive ones tend to follow that pattern pretty closely, and it becomes a lot more efficient.
So I want to go back to this notion of, Kyle, you said you think there are probably 6 or so serial entrepreneurs in each of these industries that have been critical to catalyzing.
Brad, 12 of the companies of the 48 on the list were either founded or funded or had an important role that Jesse was the key driver in those.
Okay, could you identify a couple of them? And I'd be interested, Jesse, did you know that these folks were going to go out and spawn successful companies?
I'll name them off.
But I'll define. Let me talk about 1 or 2 that were started while I was running Storage Tech. Okay. The rest probably came in after. Lease Tech Corporation.
Right.
Richard Barrett, for instance, started that here in Pearl Street, built that to a nice, very successful company, then sold it to Key Corp. That was something that Storage Tech was in the leasing products to, and selling its equipment to leasing companies. Barrett came out to do that, so he'll buy equipment from somebody, not from storage, somebody else, but do similar kind of work independently. Yeah, we're all supported that. As a matter of fact, I was a partner with him on that deal.
Right. Yeah, he's not on my list because he's part of the ecosystem. He wasn't a storage company. He leased storage devices.
Okay.
Yeah, leased it.
Others on your list?
Tom Cavanaugh and you were founders of Reference Technology, right? Weren't you an original owner of Reference?
He left to do it. But take a look at the real active ones today.
Right.
Storage Genetics in Longmont.
Uh-huh.
Another one is Atrado in Louisville.
Right. And then Awida Systems and Aspen Peripherals and what do you call it? Benchmark tape system. Right.
Chaparral. These are storage companies.
And as an investor, how did you identify the serial entrepreneurs here? How they approached you? Can you give us an instance in which you made the investment here?
In the storage arena, they predate me, even though I started in 1984 in Boulder. They predate me because of the history of storage tech. But I was fortunate early in my career to have a mentor named Carl Carmen, who was brought here by IBM, was the CEO of a couple of the businesses peripheral, this NBI at one point, and became an important venture capitalist in the community and funded many of these companies. And as a venture capitalist, I think gets a lot of the credit for your success. Right?
From Poughkeepsie, right?
Yes. Yeah, he was a...
Carl Carmen actually came with us, came to IBM, and he worked with us for quite a while.
Kyle came from Poughkeepsie, too. Well, yeah, in my distant career, because I went to Vassar College.
You did?
There was a couple of boys there when I was there.
Oh my God!
Yeah. So Carl, I had the benefit of Carl's network. Carl was a founder of Boulder Venture, so I had the benefit of his network, and having had this, 10 or 15 year experience with all of these guys, first as a co-conspirator in these entrepreneurial ventures, and then as a venture capitalist funding the rotating media and storage businesses. So that was really the origins of my. How did I evaluate these serial entrepreneurs? It was easy. Carl said, that guy and this guy, and that's where we're going. And I'll see you because I'm going to Arizona. Right?
So I want to talk a little bit about capital. And maybe you can talk about how, I know that Storage Tech went public literally 2 years after you launched, right, 1971. Yeah. Maybe you talk about how you financed it originally. And then we'll talk about, John, how you financed Left Hand from there, and then the state of capital today, because I think it's an interesting conversation to have broadly.
We're dealing with hardware product, and hardware products require a lot of money. You got to buy parts, you got to build them, you got to test them, and so on. And so, while working at IBM, we were developing a tape subsystem at IBM with a forecast of 5,000 units to be shipped over the next 5 years. But we must have done a pretty good job when we announced a product, and within a month or two after that, the forecast changed from 5,000 to 50,000. So I got the idea that, hey, this is a good time to get out and do my own kind of thing, and I get together with the other Juan and others to build, to get things going. Now, we talked to different people about funding. And the idea was, if we go out at that time, I'm talking about 1969, to raise, let's say, $3 million, probably would have to give 90% of the company away. So we said, no, let's do it differently. Let's just go out and raise initially $250,000. That's all we did.
Is that all? Is that it?
That
Who
was
gave
the
you that
beginning.
money?
J.H. Whitney and Company.
Yeah.
And
who was the guy? Who was the guy at J.H. Whitney?
Dave Dunn. But that we
Who
knew.
was also the founding investor in the first version of Exabyte, right? He didn't have anything left after they recapped it, right?
And iOmega.
iOmega. Well, he likes the storage. But the idea, we knew
How
that
much equity did he get for $250,000?
30%.
Yeah.
But the thing is, guys, this was 69 now. But the idea was 6 months later we're going to raise more money, and 6 months after that we'll have in 6 months we'll have an organization, we'll have an idea what we want to do. That's exactly what we did. 6 months later we did raise $1.2 million. Then about maybe 9 months later we raised $2 more million. Then we did an IPO. So it came in like in bits and pieces, but you're right. That first $250,000
That was money.
was a good one. I should add, well, that $250,000 that they put in, 4 years into the act, turned out to be $100 million to them.
Wow.
Good investment.
Yep.
What's $250,000 in today's money about, you think?
In $1969?
If you want to do the same thing today,
yeah. Well, what's it? No, just inflation. You know, what's a dollar in 1969?
It seems low, but it was actually,
that's probably like a couple $1 million.
Yeah, that would be my guess.
$1.5 million. Yeah.
Someone on Google's doing that right now. John, take us forward to 1999. You're launching Left Hand Networks. Talk about the fundraising around that. And I thought, Kyle, one of the interesting things about the excellent framework that you set up, funny, given what you do, I didn't see capital as part of the secret sauce. I'd like to get your view, and then we'll circle back to that. John, in terms of the fundraising process for Left Hand, how'd it go?
So my cousin had actually sent me a magazine on Fortune Small Business, and there was an article in there on Guy Kawasaki, and on the front cover it said, "We start startups." I said, "Cool, let me read this article." And he started a firm called Garage.com in Silicon Valley. And the whole idea is he took guys in their basements that didn't know what they were doing and gave them capital to start the business. They had a human capital department, so if you needed key executives to round out your team, they had a database of people that wanted to join startups, executives that wanted to join startups. They taught you how to present to venture capitalists and the whole bit. I said, this is perfect for us. So I stayed up till 2 o'clock in the morning, submitted my business plan online, and Ohanjit Jolly from Garage gave me a call the next week and gave him the pitch. And one thing led to another, and we became a Garage.com portfolio company. And angel investors actually subscribed to Garage to be part of Garage.com. Garage would screen these companies, and then once you were a Garage.com portfolio company, the angel network had access to you. And so the angel network really liked that because they didn't have to go through the job of pre-screening companies, right? These were pre-screened companies, great potential investments. So as soon as we became a Garage.com portfolio company, the phone started ringing off the hook, and we raised $500,000 in angel money over the course of a couple of months. I remember the first check we received was we gave a presentation at the Left Bank restaurant. So here's Left Hand Networks presenting at the Left Bank restaurant to some angel investors, and one of the guys wrote a check right at the table for $100,000. So I always remember that. So we raised our angel round, which allowed us to buy parts, build prototypes, and then we were doing the East Coast, West Coast A round, Series A round fundraising, and our first term sheet came from Advent International on the East Coast, and Marcia Hooper was the gal that gave us that term sheet. Terrible terms, of course. I forgot what they were specifically, but I don't know, they wanted 50% of the company for $4 million or something along those lines. And anyway, Kyle sat on a board with Marcia, right? You were on the board, and you caught wind of our deal. And the next thing you know, Kyle's associate, Sarah Gutterman, gave us a call and wanted to know what we were up to. So here was a storage deal in Kyle's backyard that he hadn't even heard of. And so He did hate that, which helped us, right? And one thing led to another.
Had you reached out to Boulder Ventures?
Yeah, we reached out. And
before that, had you?
No.
Why not?
Actually, we didn't even know of Boulder Ventures. We didn't know, we did not know the local VC community at all. We were kind of tied into the garage.com thing. We were pitching to West Coast VCs and East Coast VCs. And then we were introduced to Kyle, Kyle introduced us to the whole venture community in Boulder. And that was a real boon for us and got us going. And eventually he gave us terms we couldn't refuse. And we signed up. And we raised, actually, Kyle was real friendly. These kind of deals don't get done today, I'm told. But he gave us an escalating term sheet to where no matter how much money we raised, our dilution was the same. And so we went out and hit the road and ended up raising close to $20 million on that term sheet. So that was a great deal for us, and we got going.
Great deal for us, too. But it points out this thing on the East Coast, West Coast. I mean, I said in my introduction, the scarce resource for serial entrepreneurs. Venture capitalists, the money is fungible. It's a commodity. The scarce thing is finding guys who can start these businesses and conceptualize and actualize these opportunities. In life sciences last year, Pat Mahaffey doesn't need my help to go raise $150 million for Clovis, right? Barney Feinblum doesn't need any help raising money for a new, natural foods retailing business. Jesse wants to start a new disk drive company. He doesn't need the help of venture capitalists to do that. They're, the places where we have value add, we hope we can be helpful, but we're not the reasons these companies succeed or fail here, and we're certainly not the reason they're here. They're here for these other reasons.
Jim, you've got a long view on this. Do you agree with that?
I think in general I do. I mean, I think it was certainly helpful to the development of the data storage industry that we had some indigenous venture capital here.
Yes.
Could all of these guys have gotten funding on the West Coast without that? Probably not all of them, but most of them could have. And the ones that couldn't have probably shouldn't have been funded anyway, in hindsight. Right? But it does mean now that we have venture capital is more scarce in Colorado now than it has been for a while, and so entrepreneurs have to work harder. It takes longer to raise money, but I still think the good companies are getting financed. In the clean tech space, Colorado ranks number 2 among all states for the last 4 years as far as venture money invested. Over 90% of that money has come from out of state. And
I would say there's no indigenous clean tech organized institutional venture capital fund in Colorado, as far as I know.
And it hasn't prevented a lot of companies from getting funded. And most of those deals, at least many of them, don't have a single dollar from the state of Colorado in them. It'd be great if we had some indigenous venture capital. But again, the people who have the pedigrees and the skills to start a successful company in a space are going to find the money. If they've got what it takes to be an entrepreneur, they're going to find the money.
John, how big of a deal was it for Left Hand that Kyle, as a local individual, was vouching for the company? Would you have been able to raise without that?
I think Kyle drove the rest of the guys to fill out the round. He's great at selling the deal, and he knew Catherine Marigold in the audience here, and Tim Connor from Sequel, and a lot of the local investors, and were able to fill out the round and get the deal done. So, yeah, I mean, Kyle was instrumental in helping drive the deal.
They would have gotten it done without us. That's the reality. I mean, it's nice of John to say that, but there was a lot of demand for this. He's a good idea.
Yeah, he's a great sales guy, let me tell you.
I mean, there are some investors on the coast who really like having a local VC partner. And so would they do a deal without it? Yeah, some of them will, some of them won't. So it certainly makes it, I think, it easier to get around done, and that does have some implications for the company's trajectory, because time is opportunity, and if you're delayed 3 months in raising a round, there's a real opportunity cost that goes with that. So.
The East Coast, West Coast guys do feel more comfortable having someone locally here watching the shop. Now, you're proven, you've done it before, it's less of a deal. If they have other investments here already, it's less of a deal. If they don't have investments here and there's a local investor in the deal, that makes them feel much better. The East Coast guys hate to do deals in Colorado because of the 3.5-hour flight. The West Coast guys are a little bit more amenable to it, but
all the major venture capital funds in the U.S. that are interested in storage have made investments in Boulder before because it's a center of storage startups in the country, and they all find a way to have key advisors on the ground, not local venture funds, but key advisors on the ground who can watch after their interests, right? I mean, Peter Barrett, after his success as CEO of Exabyte, represented NEA's interests for many years here. And
May I make a comment on what you're discussing? The lifestyle that brought us here and keeps us here is a double-edged sword. I'm, as you said, a partner in a multi-billion-dollar West Coast fund, and every one of my partners there is convinced that Colorado people work less hard or less focused than our counterparts on the West Coast, and therefore they set the bar a little bit higher for investments in the state.
So I'd like to address that.
I argue that, yes, that may be true, I'm not convinced, but we sure as hell don't burn out as quickly. Which I truly believe to be the case.
That's good. Brad Feld and Phil Weiser last March took a delegation from Colorado to Silicon Valley, and I believe you heard some echoes of that concern as well. Jim, you practiced in the Valley and Boulder. Is your sense that there's a difference in terms of work ethic, or how do you assess this?
Actually, I never practiced in the Valley. I'm
sorry.
part of a firm that is headquartered in the Valley. But I think there is. I think there's something to that there's a little bit more intensity there. I think there's also people do burn out there, and I know a number of entrepreneurs I'm working with now did one or two startups in the Valley, were successful, moved to Boulder and said, I'm going to do my next one here because I think I can build a better company here without the burnout and the cycling and so forth of people that you have out there. So, I mean, there's a trade-off there.
I'll inject myself. I started my legal practice in San Francisco and moved back to Boulder, and people here work a lot harder than they were in San Francisco. Now, I was at a firm that imploded, and that might explain some things.
There's no way that people who are building companies in the Bay Area are working harder than people building companies here in Boulder, Colorado.
I totally agree with that.
I mean, maybe it's speculation, but they aren't.
So I wanted to toss in because I hear this over and over again. I've lived here 15 years. I came here from Boston, and I know Peter's point of view on the statement. I know his partner's point of view on the statement. I think his partners are completely delusional about that. So I think what there is there's a saw, there's a sort of a line that people like to use about it to justify their own geography and their own dynamics around their geography. It comes right back to Kyle's first point. Anybody who's ever worked with a West Coast-based venture firm knows that those guys spend an awful lot of time sitting in their offices waiting for the entrepreneurs to come to them. And anybody who's ever been an entrepreneur in the Valley as a startup knows that you spend an awful lot of time driving between San Jose and San Francisco, being pretty non-productive. So, the dynamics around time and life are different. The thesis that people work less hard and therefore can't generate as successful a business is bullshit. Right. The dynamics about your existence is totally different. And that's very valid. And then the ecosystem dynamics play from there. So it's very interesting. I spent a lot of time in the Bay Area over the last 15 years. My partnership was there. I will tell you that at 6 o'clock in the morning when I got on United, there were an awful lot of people on that flight. And when I showed up at the office at 8:30, my partners rolled in at 9:30 for a 9 o'clock partners meeting because they'd spent the whole weekend in Lake Tahoe. And the entrepreneurs that were the successful serial entrepreneurs, showed up for their meetings late because they were trying to catch up from being gone through. I mean, it's just the cycle of the place. And I think for the need to be more like Silicon Valley theme, which comes out of that, is baloney, be the best you can be for whatever you are in the country. It's very interesting. It doesn't matter whether you're Boulder or other parts of the country. There's some line like that you hear over and over again that justifies why the entrepreneurial activity can only be successful somewhere. And as somebody who's invested in work all over the U.S., it just makes no sense.
Yeah.
It is true, though, that people who come here from someplace else to Colorado, they like it so much they don't want to go. They want to stay here, and they want to start a business in here because they enjoy everything else. It doesn't mean they're going to slacken down and just stop working. They can do both.
I want to circle back to one final thread that Kyle teed up originally, and that's the role of the university as it related to the growth of this industry here. I'm interested, what did you find was helpful about CU, besides for generally just producing talent, and what would you have liked to see CU do differently?
Well, one thing what you said, the benefit was we did hire a lot of people from CU. A lot of the employees took classes at CU, came to function CU, so it was very positive. But one thing we did not get out of CU is any research work being done in the storage area that we can apply and end up with new products based on that technology.
And that's different than life sciences, where that's what's going on.
Yeah.
Right.
There wasn't anything going on in the storage area at CU at that time.
John, what was your experience? Did you engage with CU through Left Hand, or was it?
Yeah, we did on many fronts. So, like I said, there were small investors in Left Hand. A lot of the employees came from CU. I spoke at many events in the computer science department. They were doing a lot of R&D around storage networking, distributed systems. A lot of things that we were doing at Left Hand applied to their educational work, and so we were invited to speak quite often.
By an individual professor? What was the relationship?
Usually by the individual professor or group, or there's a lot of different situations there. And they were a big customer of Left Hands. They purchased, I want to say, in the millions of dollars worth of our hardware over the years. So. To store their data. So, a great relationship on several fronts.
Were those pre-existing relationships, or did you reach out to CU, knock on the door, and people were responsive?
I think it was just through the network. Some of the engineers that went to CU came to work for Left Hand. They knew the professors there that were doing whatever research or whatever, teaching whatever class, and it's just by word of mouth. There's no formal way of going about it, I guess.
Kyle, you've been an investor in these companies and you've taught at CU in the past. What's your perspective in terms of the engagement in this industry?
There are islands of excellence in research at the University of Colorado which are critical to these industries, right? And one of them is in computer networking. It's not specifically relevant to rotating media, but in data storage networking, how you link storage devices together, it's very, very relevant. And especially as more and more storage is in the cloud, as we say, instead of on a desktop, that networking becomes even more important. So that part of CU is a center of excellence, the computer science department, and their focus on storage networking and networking in general is very important to the local economy, as an example. And there are examples in life sciences that are directly applicable to that too. But CU is a great catalyst for this stuff, for all the human capital and intellectual property reasons. And it's not an impediment, which some universities are, right? Harvard University is an impediment to entrepreneurship in Boston. MIT is the opposite. MIT is a catalyst for entrepreneurship. So CU goes into the catalyst department, not as the impediment department.
I thought everybody from Harvard became a venture capitalist.
Seems like it some days, doesn't it?
All right, so I want to make sure to leave time for audience questions. And as Claire mentioned, we have a student affirmative action policy with respect to questions. So throw it out. Is there a student that's got the first question? All right, seeing no student takers on the offer, let's open it up. Alan, any question? Go ahead. Yeah, up here.
I guess this is for Kyle.
If you wait for the microphone. Rick.
Sorry. I'm curious in your 5 or 6 contributing factors to a successful entrepreneurial community, whether that was, in a sense, prioritized the way you displayed it, or, and if not, do you think there is a priority, in particular this anchor tenant, which seems to be missing outside of storage and perhaps life science?
And natural foods retail.
Yes.
That's a really good question. I don't know that how I'd have to think a lot harder to figure out. It's probably a different answer for each of these industries, different from each other in terms of the anchor tenant versus place. Place, I think, is the most important thing to the entrepreneurial community here in Boulder. right? Because there is a person who wants to come here and work here and will stay here. And it's not everybody, and it's not for everybody, but the guy who will, or the individual who will, this is their place. And so that's a very powerful thing here. The university is a really important thing. And I guess I'd put those two at the top of the heap in each industry. And then certainly an anchor tenant is really critical. And we've talked a lot at this panel appropriately about the importance of the anchor tenant and the serial entrepreneurs who rotate around that anchor tenant. And that's pretty critical in each of these.
That's interesting. And so would you have considered IBM the anchor tenant when you got started, or was it there was nothing there and Storage Tech became that anchor tenant de facto?
Well, it's funny. As I think Storage Tech became the anchor tenant. IBM was like an old company with a lot of people in it, and the idea of leaving IBM is not something that anybody or people will do. It's a big move to leave IBM. I'm talking back in the 60s now. People didn't do that. You got a job for life.
That was the Google of its day. It was the best place to work, and you were the smartest guy if you got a job there.
And people didn't leave. They stayed. And leaving was not that easy either. You're working very hard to stay.
Why?
Hey, Brad. I'd like to tell a story about anchor tenant, and it deals with the world in the year 1500.
When the technology was navigation, technology secrets were maps, and the world had been divided by the Pope into two nations, Portugal and Spain. And basically, Portugal had everything east of that, and Spain had everything west of that. They met in the Philippines. But the technology was navigation, and the base, the tenant company, if you will, was all these people that were navigating, and the two ports from which they departed were across the river from each other in the different countries. And all the navigation technology in the world existed within 20 miles. And basically all the navigants departed from those two ports. And obviously technology was traded between them. There was some proprietary stuff. If you were the navigator, you were the top technologist of the area. But in fact, everything every expedition that started from Europe started from that point. It was 100 years later that the Dutch and so on started to go around the world.
Other questions? Thank you, Warren. Alan?
Thank you. It's in perhaps contrast to the storage industry and its development, and perhaps as successful companies in that area, you might have a great point of view about what I'm, at least by my perception, and only been here 15 years, so I don't know if I'm wrong about this, but it seems like there are also some non-productive ecosystems that didn't produce any lineages, and I think about Ball Aerospace, and I think about the people that I've spoken to in the last couple of years from that company. They say, oh my God, our IT technology is 5 years, 8 years behind the times. It's got old style, old IBM type corporate thinking within the company, but perhaps the lines of business are so capital intensive, it's very hard for a startup to maybe.
No, it's because the customer is the government. That's why nothing ever came of it.
So that a little bit more, Kevin.
Whose customer is the government, right? One
company.
successful company.
And so you don't see it as a missed opportunity. You just didn't think that was something that was an opportunity at all.
It was never going to become an opportunity. It did create a large infrastructure, though, of service providers and companies that sold the ball and created, and managers, and out of that came some interesting things unrelated to the business of Ball Aerospace, unrelated to satellites and satellite stuff, right? So I mean, it had a beneficial benefit to the industry. But as an anchor tenant, it failed. And the reason it failed is because its customer is the government.
During especially the 70s and 80s, right, we seem to have business cycles that were counter-cyclical.
and we kept retiring each other's talent down. As they went down, we went up. As we went down, they went up. But basically, all the all the skill sets were very, very similar to what we needed.
You all have referenced the role of serial entrepreneurs. You, in particular, Kyle, about that being where the money is best laid, as it were. Obviously, there's that chicken and egg syndrome where you have to start it somewhere, to do it again, then to do it again and do it again. With clean tech being identified as one of the areas that we feel like is a potential strength, for the region, for Colorado, and what have you. Are some of the innovators in that area, whether they be engineers or biologists or chemists or what have you, are they best suited by potentially recruiting, entrepreneurs from other arenas like software, people who have done it maybe in a different industry or a different area, but have done it. They've grown a company regardless of the technology. Are they well suited to maybe seek out some of those people, either as CEOs, as mentors, as advisors, or all three? To help get some of these technologies off the ground, since they're in a new area, no one's ever done it before.
Yes, but it's not clear what the success model for these clean tech companies is yet. We know there's going to be some big successes there, but it's not at all clear what that model looks like. We're not, and I'm not an expert in that field, and I watch in awe of these companies that have been started around it. It has been interesting that there are quite a few prominent, successful serial entrepreneurs in Boulder who have been involved now with clean tech companies. We saw Paul Berberian's startup a couple weeks ago at the Venture Capital in the Rockies, who's a guy I've backed in multiple startups in the past 10 years, has a solar concentrator thing that here. My colleague Neil Cannon's in the office, one of the most successful entrepreneurs here in Boulder in the optics area, is involved in an LED lighting company here that's making great progress. So you're seeing some of the most successful local serial entrepreneurs start to focus on these kind of opportunities, but it's not clear the way it is in data storage. What are the elements of success, or in life sciences, or in natural foods retailing? Those are pretty well defined, I think, in terms of what we're looking for and what's the next thing. It's not clear yet what the success case or who the anchor tenant's going to be. Vestas might be the anchor tenant in Boulder, maybe for clean tech. I don't know. Maybe ConocoPhillips.
Clean tech can benefit by having some of these experienced entrepreneurs to join them in maybe some capacity, whether on the board or CEO or what have you. There's no question that would be very helpful to that industry.
There's been a huge migration of technical and management talent in there, and a lot of those skill sets I think are readily transferable. How to do large-scale manufacturing. There's people that know how to do that and can apply those disciplines. Mm-hmm. There's also whole new areas that people have to worry about there, like bankability. Thinking about how it whether the product that you're selling is financeable by lending institutions. Well, you don't have to worry about that in a lot of these other businesses, but it's a huge issue if you're selling solar panels or wind turbines.
Final question, Joyce.
A question for Jesse. Did you target size? Did you look to be a dominant force in storage from the outset?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we saw the market to be huge, big market, and we wanted a piece of that. So we thought if we could get 10% of that market, be like 50,000 units, we'd get 5,000. You multiply that, how much that is, we'll make a decent business. But as we got going, obviously we wanted more and more. Want to add more products, got more revenues, and we kept on expanding it. But in the beginning, when we first started the company, we were looking for a little piece.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
One follow-up question to that is, had there been a, say, acquisition offer that was comparable to some of the liquidity that you got when you went public, would you have taken it, or was
There were many
effort
acquisition offers. There were many.
So, and
our thinking was, we did not want to do it. We would like to build value before we get there. We saw it all ahead of us. We're not anxious to do it. So we rejected them. I'm talking about several.
John, Jim, Kyle, and Jesse, I want to thank you for a terrific discussion. Many thanks.
Thank you.
We're going to do a quick change out. The third panel is going to go. We're not going to take a break, so we'll go right into the third panel here.
time is dinner?
This one or I've got one.
Good, we'll see you there.
Are you coming?
Great.
Yeah.
Excellent. Should we take the tie off then?
I am, yeah. Take it off right now.
Hey, Jim. Hey, Bill. How are you? Nice to see you.
I love your face.
Well, you're a shining example, right? Right? You relate, right? I don't have to explain it to you.
We haven't met. I'm John Barber. You gave me the image, one of the images I need. I'm just going to refer back.
You're welcome to use it. I never copyrighted it.
I don't know where they want it yet.
Do you want us any place in particular? No, I'm just trying to remember to introduce you to order. I guess. And I can know where. I will just follow it.
I think you're next to me.
John's going to want to be on the end. At least that's where the other moderators are going. No, John's the moderator. So I think he'll want to be on the end. I'm Bill.
So we'll just go in the order, right? So give Bill his name tag here. How about that? And then put Joe down there. There we go.
A little self-help.
It looks like such a simple task, but it's not always the case, right?
Yeah.
So how many Oracle people are there?
In the audience?
No, I just mean in Boulder.
In Boulder. All right, so there is a small office at the Research Park, which is mostly Crystal Ball.
Hi, Joe.
Jim Franklin's the one that's there. There's the former Sun campus. It has all the storage tech people merged into it. There's a couple thousand there. And then there's the former J.D. Edwards campus down in South Denver in the Tech Center. Hey, Joe, Bill Murray. Hi, Sharon. And there's probably, I don't know, another 1,500 there. And then there's a facility down just by the Air Force Academy, and I don't know how many people are there, but it's considerable.
So have you been here a long time, or are you
well, have I been in Oracle or in the Air? I came to Boulder in 1982, so quite a while, and I first joined Sun in 97. I left to do a sabbatical with a startup company for a couple of years, came back about 3 years ago to go start some companies for them around the world.
All right, good afternoon. I know it's the end of a long day.
Good to see you.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and take our seats. We'll get started on the third panel. Thank you all for being with us here at this conference this afternoon. I want to thank Silicon Flatirons and thank Brad Bernthal. First of all, I'd like to introduce our panel today. I got Joe Zell to my left here, general partner at Growtech, and I think his expertise on communication and outsourcing is going to be, I hope, particularly pertinent for today's discussion. Bill Moose, who I think many of you know, is currently the legal director at Oracle, and he's certainly got a long history with the family tree we've already seen today. And I think his history is also an impressively entrepreneurial one, so I think his contribution today is going to be wonderful. We have here from the two folks from the University of Colorado, along with myself, Sharon Matisic, Associate Professor with the Leeds School of Business. She's the Director of the Doctoral Program in Strategic, Organizational, and Entrepreneurial Studies. And finally, last but certainly not least, Meredith Benaziak. She's an instructor with the Department of Architecture and in the Environmental Design Program here on the Boulder campus. And she's a specialist on neuroscience and the psychology of space. Got her bachelor's degree in the classics, though, I think, which she'll appreciate something, I think, about the beginning of the presentation today. And certainly the psychology of space, both real and virtual. And I think our task for the last panel of the day, which is to look at innovation in the architecture of geography, is much less specialized than the last two discussions. We've been asked to paint a very broad picture this afternoon and look at the possibility for what innovation and what place means for the future, and to see if we can't ask some pertinent questions both of the panel and of all of you and of the community as a whole on this particular topic. Before I introduce myself, I'd like to say generally, I want to ask two broad questions, and then I'll have some more specific questions for the panel. And these questions are, what is the connection between a skilled workforce, and we've certainly heard some discussions on that today, innovation and place as a whole, and then what should we expect from this connection over time? And to get to that, I want us to look at three themes: innovation and place, innovation and acceleration, and in case you can't recognize it, that is a grain of rice writ large on our screen. It'll all make sense in due course of time. And the third is innovation in this room, or innovation in Boulder, and what does that mean for Boulder and our ecosystem and our community here? That fellow there on the mast you might recognize as Odysseus, right there. My name's John Barber. I'm also with the College of Architecture and Planning with the Environmental Design Program. And I'm also an entrepreneur, which means I'm shameless. So I'm going to use this as a short moment to plug what I'm about, and also to use that as a leaping board to get to where we want to go. Odysseus, we'll remember, he was quite an entrepreneur and quite an inventive fellow himself. Came up with the Trojan horse, ended the Trojan War. 10 long years of war he ends, and after those 10 long years of war, all he really wants to do is just get back to Ithaca and get back to his wife. He's got that one goal. He gets back into the ship. He's heading home, but that's not in the fate for him. If you remember the story, the ship crashes on the rocks. He's stuck on an island for 7 long years before he can finally get a crew together. They move out into the ocean, hopping from island to island, having no idea where they're going. And they end up on an island called Aea, where Circe finally shows them the way home, and she becomes their advisor, and she works with them to give them everything that they need to finally find their way back to Ithaca. So my other role here in Boulder is I'm the director of a small professional services company called Aea, and all we look at is innovation management and innovation cycles. We started as a think tank right here at the University of Colorado, and we're just now this year really beginning to burgeon out from that. And so when we talk about organizational health and ideation and all these other things, just that idea of organizational health and innovation management is tied directly to place. And so we look at this question of innovation and place, and today we've already heard this theme that there seems to be a question about the connection between innovation and place and expertise. And 6 years ago, I was the University International Postgraduate Scholar at the University of New South Wales, the Faculty of the Built Environment, and there with the People for Places and Spaces and the Department of Infrastructure Planning and Natural Resources, we looked at a number of factors that were affecting innovation in and around Australia. And when Brad Bernthal asked me to moderate the panel and to speak just a little bit before we started the panel, it raised some issues for me that are now several years old, and I decided to spend the last couple of weeks updating some of those data. So when we look at this, we're looking at we're looking at the availability of a skilled workforce. We're looking at the size of the market, kind of represented by the size of the circles there. We can see Darwin in the Northern Territory there, very, very small. We can see New South Wales in the south, very, very big. And we can see sort of the general ratio of the skill in that workforce, those people with bachelor's and graduate degrees or specialist certifications. Now, today I don't have nearly the time to talk about all of these data, but let's just look at regional access to a skilled workforce, and then in the green, the amount that's spent in private R&D dollars on industry and development in each of those areas. So we can say there, we know that Darwin in the Northern Territory is kind of small, 250,000 people in the city, but it's got good infrastructure, it's very well educated, lots of interesting industry and research going on there, $30.9 million per year in private spending on research and development. But we compare that to Sydney at $3.5 billion, and we think, well, yeah, Sydney's bigger, but something else is going on there. So we look at urban density and population and the access that innovation and innovative companies have to those workforces and to those markets and the infrastructure that goes with them. And it occurred to us in the original study that at that point we were going to modify our original search data. And we took the amount of money that was being spent in each market on research and development, and we just turned it into a per capita figure. We divided it by the number of people in the workforce and the number of people in the market. And now we see something more interesting happening. We see Sydney is at $445, and we see the Northern Territory and other areas around Sydney at $137. And we're seeing a little bit of a disconnect between the availability of that skilled workforce and the amount of money that's being spent on R&D. And now, of course, we could be looking at a whole lot more factors than we really should be, but given that I've got about 10 minutes to do this, we'll just keep it simple. Now, if we complicate the situation a little bit, Sydney's a pretty easy way to illustrate that. Darwin to Sydney, yeah, so what? But if we bring it a little bit closer to home, we look at the United States. Here we are in Boulder, Colorado, and we can talk about plenty of places that have already been discussed today: Redmond, Cupertino, Lincoln, Nebraska. Cornhuskers fans in the room? No? All right. Me neither. Safe bet. All right. So if we look at some of these same factors here and we regionalize that, and we talk about regional access to a skilled workforce, we can see some prominent players showing up on the map, and we can be happy to say that Colorado is one of those here in the center of the Midwest. We see the usual corridor in the Northeast. We see a corridor in the West. But then if we look at R&D dollars spent, we get massive R&D expenditures naturally in Washington, and we get them in California, we get them in Michigan, well that makes sense, and we get them in Minnesota, and again in that Northeast corridor. But if we really look carefully at that, and you'll have to bear with me, I'm a geographer and a social scientist first, but if we look at the maps, we see that there's shifting there that doesn't necessarily make sense. Let me see if I can illustrate that. If we look at just the top 10 in per capita spending, we get Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Washington, Delaware. If we had chosen the same places by access to skill of the workforce, we would have gotten Washington, Georgia, Minnesota, Maine, and Vermont, and we would have been at the low end on 3 of them. So right away, this raises a question about what might be happening in place over time. And I'll see if I can get to that time component. But just to give us the comparison of the scale, we don't have to go too far north before we get to the bottom of the scale in terms of spending by companies in that region on R&D dollars. Washington at 62. But this leads us to some correlations, and this is these numbers shouldn't be taken as scientific today. This is leapfrogging off of the work that we did 6 years ago, and now I'm just raising it as a question, if nothing else. But when we look at the physically present, highly trained population as a correlation to innovation, so the presence of that population or the lack of presence of that population in any given place, we get, first of all, an extremely weak correlation. It doesn't seem to be much correlated at all. And normally this is just the kind of thing that we would throw out. But we get a negative correlation on top of that, minus 0.1. And in 1997, it was 0.1. So looking at this over time, we would say, well, what this is telling us is not that we don't need an educated workforce to innovate. That's not it at all. We all here know that that's not the case. What we're seeing is we're seeing a disconnect in terms of where people who have those educations are going over time. And while these correlations aren't strong, check back with me in 12 years, and we'll see if this isn't actually suggesting that these places are becoming even less tied. So if we remember that triangle, that connection between innovation and place, and then that skilled workforce, those highly trained people that we want in working for our companies, for our storage techs, for our oracles, we're seeing something slipping. There's a change in the relationship physically in these spaces. And then if we look using density and population as a shorthand to also talking about infrastructure and all the other things in terms of markets that we need, that one is clearly and strongly correlated and has been historically for a long time. And at this point, if we had enough time, I could insert a whole nother conversation about immigration and brain drain here. That there's a decentralization of our relationship between places and those people who are most capable of delivering the kind of innovation that we need. So, now if we look at those innovations, instead of just the densities or the infrastructure in those places, we look at the places where money is actually being spent, we can make now not conclusions, but we can ask some critical questions. And I'm going to see if I can get us to the point where we can all clearly understand those questions together. We can say that there's an inertia to this phenomena of innovation. We're always trying to pin down what is it that makes a place innovative. And we can say that for whatever reasons those places develop a culture of innovation, that culture is likely to change very, very slowly. I think Brad put it very, very well that he said, we could screw it up, but it's going to take a while for it to screw up. So if we can just please not screw it up in the meantime, great. Industries also tend to reside, we all know this, they tend to reside in certain locales, but company connection is actually quite weak. We can get the Sun Microsystems and we can get the Oracles striking out and finding new fertile ground. So they find that fertile ground, they sprout wherever they find. So there's opportunities for new centers of innovation to rise as long as we've got all of those components, a strong university being one of them. And then lastly, that connection to people. And we can go right back to the brain drain here as well as other phenomena of migration, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. So, predictions. Cities, I suspect, will remain strong engines of innovation, and current centers will remain strong engines of innovation for a long time to come. And I'm hoping our panel and our room can provide some of their opinions and expertise on this. Another supposition, industry centers are going to relocate very, very slowly. But companies, I suspect, will become more mobile and more dynamic than they are now. We'll see what our panelists think of that. And then last, highly skilled workers will increasingly be able to work from anywhere. Most will do so from cities. And they will choose cities, and thank you very much, Kyle, they will choose cities increasingly for amenities, not for industries. So as suppositions, I'll throw those out to our panel and to the audience as well. And so when I look at this connection, innovation, expertise, and place, it was posed to me when I was originally asked to present this. It was posed to me as, can we explore whether there's a possibility of a break between place and innovation? Is it possible that place is becoming less important? Is Thomas Friedman correct? And actually, I would suggest that what we're really seeing is the beginning of a break between expertise and place. And that's an entirely different phenomenon to be discussing. And we haven't had a lot of discussion today for Silicon Flatirons being so very, very much centered on telecommunications technology. It really hasn't come up today. So, that grain of rice. When we really do talk about computing power and broadband and wireless and all of those, if you'll just indulge me for a moment, we'll use a little example. If I were to take a piece of rice and I were to flick it out into the audience, as long as I didn't hit anybody in the face, it's going to land on the floor. Brad's going to give me a dirty look for getting something on the floor of the Whitmire courtroom, but the cleaning crew will come up and they'll take care of that soon enough. And if we all agreed to come back here tomorrow and all sit together again, and we did the same exercise, and I threw 2 into the audience, and the next day 4 and 8 and 16 and 32 and so forth and so on, we've got a lot of people in this audience who understand Moore's Law. And they understand the compounding of exponential numbers over time. Well, then, after a week, we'd have enough maybe to make a couple of sushi rolls and share the snack. But after 30 days, we'd have enough to dust the floor of this room. And by dust, I mean we'd be kicking it around. It'd be getting into our shoes. We'd be pulling out of our socks at the end of the day. After one more week, we'd have enough rice to fill this room. After 2 months, we'd have enough to cover this entire campus 1,000 feet deep. After 3 months, we'd have enough to cover the Earth deeper than Mount Everest. Now, we don't have that problem with rice. Technology has no such limitations other than our ingenuity. So, when we talk about technology having no biological limitations, and we use this example of how many doublings have we been through, we're sort of between that 4th and 5th week in terms of doubling. We're between kicking the stuff around on the floor with our feet and filling up the room. And so frequently I think we get into these discussions and we're focused on a very, very short period of time in front of us. And we're thinking very, very linearly about these problems. And at least for one panel, let's see if we can open up and think about it a little bit more broadly. And if we just think about all these technologies, that if you come to any of these other Silicon Flatirons events, we're talking about these sorts of technologies and the impact that they're going to have on us, and the impact that they're going to have on India, and the impact that they're going to have on China and our relationships with those places. So again, what is the connection between a skilled workforce, innovation, and place? And what should we expect from this connection over time? Here in Boulder, Colorado, anywhere else in the world. So, thank you. And I would like to talk less now. And if you give me just a second to get over here, and we'll ask the panelists some questions. Okay. Let's see if I can get myself organized here. Also, the last time I really presented, it was this particular topic. It was in Sydney, Australia, and everybody wore ties. So in Boulder, Colorado, we just don't wear ties. It's a nice place. We can do without the tie. Okay, so maybe the question that I'd like to pose to the panel first, and then just see where this goes, is how is it that you think that technologies are changing geographical human relationships in industry, in learning, and in these other important factors of life that we know have something to do with innovation? Joe, you want to start?
Sure. I guess the context of this for me is that I work principally now with very early stage startup companies, and what I see technology doing is not necessarily changing the place aspect of this. Although I would say that because of technology, most people are now working most of the time, and it no longer really matters where they are. They can be writing code in the back of the room, as one gentleman is, or doing their work on a bus or a train or whatever. But I guess from my standpoint, we've not seen in the early stage arena that I've been participating in some huge movement towards the use of collaboration technologies, telepresence technologies, or other technologies that would make it so that you could have a virtual startup where people were located all over. We still very much believe that innovation and success comes through strong leadership, close coordination. I think some of those tools are making some of those things easier, but we have not seen a fundamental shift in technology changing the place aspect of it. I see it in lots of ways, allowing for faster cycle time in software development, using agile methodology that is clearly technology enabled to allow people to iterate more quickly. I think there's much less lag time between communication. I think it's much easier now to seek customer input. As an example, Juan was an early investor in his son-in-law's company HiveLive that I participated in, where they were using social networking to gather data from customers in live real time, almost like a worldwide or nationwide focus group. So I see technology helping companies form better strategies, get more timely information about their customers and their competitors. I see it helping them make their development cycle faster. I don't see it changing where they pick teammates, at least not in really early stage companies.
Yeah, I would concur with that, Joe. My sense about technology is It's not going to replace the need for a physical network. Listen to what John said about getting hooked up with Kyle and all of a sudden having this network of individuals. That probably wouldn't have happened if they hadn't met face to face and had that connection of being local and being able to in essence, spread the innovation and get started from that. Where I've seen technology make a huge difference, though, is helping companies scale and giving them different tools to do so. So if you look back at Sun, when we had our big burst in the late 1990s, I think it's not. I think it's entirely coincidental, or there's a direct connection between the fact that that's when Sun branched out and said, we cannot get the scale of resources that we need within the valley anymore, and certainly not at economic terms. So we built a campus here in Colorado, built a campus in Austin, another one in Burlington, reached out to key areas around the world and went global. Sort of the next concentric circle around that was adopting basically a virtual office approach that would enable you to bring in the resources from anywhere. But as Joe said, I think that the core innovation, the core business management was located very tightly.
Mm-hmm. So when you're saying that the core management is always seems to be located quite tightly, but you're drawing resources from outside, could you speak more to that and say how that might have changed over time, what your early experiences were in the industry, and how that factor of it might have altered in the last 10 years or so?
Well, I think there have been a lot of factors that have gone and driven it to become a more virtual global enterprise, and I think that's what you have to be as a large company. And one of the interesting questions for me is, why is it that Colorado has so few companies that have really scaled up to the level of a storage tech and stayed local? For the most part, they tend to get bought by companies located in other centers that have different advantages of place. And the question that I have is, what are the impediments to keeping us from reaching that next level? And I think there's a whole host of them that we can talk about. But over the past 10 years, obviously you've had technology make it easier. So as Joe mentioned, you can be working anywhere in the world, anytime, and it's seamless. I mean, it used to be that it was a big deal to make a global phone call. Now it happens many times a day. Internet connectivity, the agile software development methodology. I mean, there's so many ways that you can collaborate and share. So once you have that core focus, that core area, going and get other people to participate in it from other areas is a very easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess I have an example first. How many of you are familiar with the company Innocentive? I know Josh is going to raise his hand because he's my MBA student. We talked about it. Here's a company with a fascinating business model. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's a company that kind of grew out of Eli Lilly. And Eli Lilly had this issue where they'd have problems and they didn't really know how to solve them. And so initially they had this kind of intranet where they'd post these problems and people from anywhere in the company would try to solve them. Well, they open this up and they spin it off into this company called Innocentive. And so essentially what you have is companies with problems that don't have the expertise to solve those problems, and people all over the world that want to solve problems. And so here you have a business model where any company could put a problem out there, and it obviously costs money to put the problem out there, and then anyone in the world can register to solve this problem. And so problems from the pharmaceutical industries, you've got the Eli Lillys of the world, the pharmaceutical companies, to ExxonMobil, who's trying to figure out a technology to help manage the oil spill in Alaska, things like that. You've got this amazing technology where you can put these problems out there and people from all over the world can solve them. And in some ways, what an amazing thing, right? So you've got these skills that are distributed across the world, and here's a vehicle whereby people can look for these problems, solve these problems, and what they do is they generally offer a prize. So if you're the first one to solve the problem, you could win $10,000 to $1 million, depending on what the company thinks the problem is worth. So in some ways, it's a great way to outsource solving of problems. But that said, so what does that do? It provides a vehicle where you can access lots of people. The technology itself is nothing that revolutionary in terms of what's out there, but I think what's shifted over time is kind of the culture along with that. The culture of how do you solve problems, how do you involve people in solving your problems. So the technology had to be there as a condition for that to take place. But I think what we're seeing to some extent is somewhat of a shift in terms of views of knowledge ownership and views of knowledge creation and how that should take place. Now, that said, that's not a be-all, end-all, because, what does that allow you to do? It allows you to solve problems efficiently that are kind of modular in nature. So I can break them off and put them out there, and then someone in Russia who has a great science background can help me solve this problem, and it's efficient for me because I paid $50,000. If I had to hire someone, it would cost a lot more. But that's only certain kinds of things. If we talk about transferring tacit knowledge and trust, that's something that's really localized. One of the comments that Kyle made that I thought was really interesting when he was talking about Boulder is, it's a small community, everyone knows each other. So building that kind of community of trust becomes very important for these knowledge transfer issues, and I think also in terms of just transferring tacit knowledge. So it's one thing to have a problem that's very bounded and solve that through technology, through these longer distance relationships. But when you're talking about things that involve people getting together and working on a problem jointly and sharing tacit knowledge, we're just not there in terms of the technology yet.
Maybe I'll insert an example here from my own experience. One of our clients right now is a nonprofit startup called The Last Ocean, and it was started by a National Geographic photographer named John Weller and by Dr. David Ainley, who's one of the preeminent Antarctic scholars on marine species in the Antarctic, a handful of other folks, and they all met here. This is where that locus happened. This is where that face-to-face happened. And they probably actually see each other face-to-face every 4 months because they're on a boat somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Their communication is now almost daily. I mean, they've gotten to the point where the satellite technology is so good, and certainly when they can plug into a landline, that communication is almost instantaneous. So I wonder if there's not a function of scale here, and I wonder if there's not a function between, and certainly here at Silicon Flatirons, we talk about startups, and we talk about large companies, and we have great representation here from the whole spectrum. And so I wonder if we could speak generally to our experiences with startups or with spin-offs versus established companies and the different sorts of challenges they face. And I wonder if we're not seeing a shift that has something to do also with scale of industry.
Well, one thing that I would interject on this is that my belief is that we're in some ways oversimplifying the discussion, trying to tie innovation to place and to skilled workforce. If you think about what's happening in Boulder, it very much supports the belief that it takes a village. So if you want to have innovative startups, it's not about just finding a smart person or a good idea. It's about having an ecosystem that has the right kinds of talent available, the right kinds of mentors available, the right kinds of resources available from the university setting, from an engineering, law, marketing, business, or other standpoint. And it involves having a strong enough general economic ecosystem that people feel that they can afford to take the risk because their spouse is able to cover the other part of the income, or because they can take that risk because they know if this doesn't work, there will be other jobs there. So there's a critical mass aspect to it. But my principal bias in all this is that the innovative startups that succeed, it has a lot more to do with the right team and the right relationship between and among that team than it does, are they in Boulder, are they in Denver, are they in Poughkeepsie? Mm-hmm. I think it has a lot more to do with, do you have the right group of people with really good relationships, tightly aligned in an ecosystem that provides them with direction, capital, mentoring, and the other resources that they need to be successful. And I do think that Bill's point and the point that Sharon was making about scale and kind of the age of the firm makes a huge difference. It's a very different animal to have that function well with 10 people, than to be able to say, look, we're now at 100. Can we afford to start getting some resources somewhere else? I think that's very much true. I flew recently with a guy that runs the outsourced technology group at Quest now. So they have 1,200 developers in India. And his job is to fly back and forth and manage the 1,200 developers. And so he was talking about, how they were innovating. And it was much like what Sharon was describing, where they could simply put out a challenge saying, we'll pay for dinner if you stay and work a few hours on this business problem. And they do. So, there are different cultures where there are lots of innovative breakthroughs that can occur. But I think we have to separate that from how do you get a strong team working closely together, working into the wee hours, willing to solve problems when they hit them. Because I think that this whole virtual concept is just fine when you already know each other, there's no big conflict, and it's a pretty routine process, right? And it's a pretty well-defined process. But with startups, something breaks every day. Some new roadblock hits every day. And I think there it's then location matters because they need to be proximate, have trust, have relationship, and be able to solve the problems.
Yeah, Joe, the point that you make about security, feeling secure in the environment is one that I've definitely experienced. I know that both at startups I've worked at and at Sun, we've tried to bring people in from the Valley, and at times we've been very successful, and at other times I've had people say, if this doesn't work out here, where else am I going to go to get a job writing code, doing this, doing that? In the Valley, I know there's, just drive down 101 and look at the billboards. There's all these places that I can go if this doesn't work out, and I feel safe doing that. And I think that's part of the reason that you've seen specialization happen. And, this has become a center for storage. Right. So if you're in the storage area, you have that level of comfort. Same thing with life sciences and some of the other industries. The thing that will be really interesting for me is to see how China's experiment works, trying to mandate specialization. I mean, if you look at the southern part of China where all the manufacturing is, you have your city that does electric motors, you have your city that does brooms, you have your city that does textile buttons and such, and they seem to be trying to replicate that through mandate, and it'll be really interesting to see 5-10 years from now as to whether that's worked.
So maybe stay on this for a little bit longer, then see if we can steer it to some other topics. But Bill, to that, what role do you think that specialization will continue to play, particularly in place? I know in the case of Oracle that to be in Boulder is not the same thing as to be in San Francisco for Oracle. It's definitely an extension for you. So do you see any dilution of the role of a specialized place over time, or if places like Boulder, which are perhaps less specialized, play a different sort of role in innovation down the line than they have previously?
Yes and no. I think that Friedman has it right when he says that the world is becoming flat and that you have a global economy, and the economy has just gotten so much bigger that you are going to have more centers, and it is now possible to have more than a single center in a single industry to be a center of innovation. But I do think that you will continue to see those centers, and I think that in order to scale, the companies in those centers are going to need to source resources, both in terms of R&D resources and certainly in terms of sales and marketing, from other places in order to compete at the largest levels.
Okay. Maybe to change the angle here just a little bit and see if we can bring a couple of divergent ideas together a little bit. Meredith, I know that you've had some work that you've done with, I think, with L3D and with a few of the other units here that are connected with the University of Colorado campus that are specifically looking at this issue of virtual collaboration over space. And I'm going to fight hard to pull it in some of those directions, and we'll see how well I do in the next 15 minutes or so. What do you see as being some of the critical developments from certainly the research and development side of that right now, and then where do you see it going in the next several years?
Okay, so I think that, well, going back to the point that you made during your presentation about innovation will continue to occur in cities or will occur in cities because of amenities there. I actually think that's not the case because the cities are currently supporting our access to lots of people and lots of information. And that's what technology it can provide us in a way far more reaching than a physical place can. So our virtual sites are hyperloaded with information, which allows us to not have to be tied to a city. So we can now move to these more amenity-driven developments which are springing up, which is, as the last session pointed out, why we all live in Boulder. And the amenity-driven cities are supporting other processes for creativity and innovation in terms of reducing our stress or promoting divergent thinking. So I guess going back to your question about what is the role of technology? It's where we can have the access to information and the communication of information, and we still need to create places, virtual places, as much as we're designing our physical places that we live for that exchange to happen successfully.
Okay. Sharon, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting because we've been talking a lot about the benefits of specialization and having a lot of people together in the same place that do the same sort of thing, and I think about your comments about space. And, I'm going to geek out a little bit. Since Brad talked about agglomeration economies, I feel like I can do it too. There's essentially two kinds of agglomeration economies, benefits that come from specialization, so you have a lot of people in the same general area, and that allows you to have all the support that you need and depth of knowledge, etc. But there's also these urbanization economies, which I think is sort of what you were getting at with some of your population density information. And I guess I wonder, in terms of those urbanization economies, essentially you've got people that have different backgrounds, different ideas coming together because you're in a relatively dense population area, and that creates new ideas and opportunities for innovation that are more radical in nature, right? So it's not so much we're getting better and better at these innovations in the same general area, but rather we end up, talking together because we live down the hall from each other or something like that, and suddenly, there's a fundamental recombination that's different than anything we've thought about before. And I don't know that, I can't see how those urbanization economies can be replaced by technology, because I think there's kind of a serendipitous element and that kind of chance element where you bring people together and it's that exchange of information that you wouldn't necessarily go and seek out in kind of a virtual community.
No, I would absolutely agree with it. With you on that point. I think it's these smaller developments, these amenity-driven communities, where those because if you're no longer bringing together people who are sharing things in terms of industry and career and specialization, but they're coming together because they have a common interest in lifestyle, then you're doing exactly what you're saying is occurring in a city. So I think that's going to happen. But they're able to live in those developments because they have access to the information and knowledge they need through the virtual.
So I would challenge that slightly. And I completely agree with you that the fact that you have these distance collaboration technologies available to you makes smaller communities more viable, but a certain advantage that I think you get with urbanization is just physical infrastructure. The point was made on the last panel that East Coast VCs don't like doing deals in Colorado because it's a 4-hour flight to get here. Try doing international business from Colorado. Without DIA, it would be absolutely impossible. And it would be very hard. And I think that part of the reason that Boulder, a community of 100,000 within the city limits, can survive so well is it's really a suburb of a big metropolitan area like Denver, and you've got that infrastructure. So I think there are limits as to how far you're really going to be able to push out into the hinterland with broad-scale innovation.
And certainly I hope there wasn't any point to the presentation that was mistaken. The reality is that we have projections that somewhere between 3/4 and over 80% of every man, woman, and child on Earth is going to be living in a city by about 2060, 2070. So we're clearly moving toward a modality of this is the century of the city. So somehow this relationship between the places that we occupy and the dynamics of those places that we occupy, but then also this opportunity for the chance encounter. It's great for the code jockey to be able to drive down the road and see and know sign after sign of the places that they can do business. But those aren't necessarily, I think, probably the kinds of environments where we see some of the best kinds of transdisciplinary innovation, where we're dealing with the real sticky problems of whether it be in computing, but more frequently in just how we deal with the markets, or how we deal with social problems, or how we deal with other sorts of endeavors that human beings have to deal with. So somewhere we're walking a fine line between this issue of specialization, or the agglomeration economy of the second variety that Susan was talking about, where it's not the specialization that causes the dynamic in the economy, but the access to a multiplicity of different sorts of specialities in the economy. And I'm wondering how much the virtual gives specialized economies access to that decentralized information, and how much it gives non-specialized economies, the agglomerate urban economies, access to specialized information. New York has access to San Francisco, and what does that do? And vice versa. So, again, we're talking about two different sorts of scales, perhaps, of industry here. The Oracles and the Sun Microsystems versus the small startups and the kinds of ventures that Sharon is talking about supporting. So, Brad?
Can I just ask that you interject that an age factor as well?
Sure.
And what I mean by that is I think that if you had a 22-year-old on the panel, you'd be getting a very different point of view about this dynamic. I think that I would assert that I think that there's an imbalance in terms of the weight and the importance of physical geography here, and some of that is generational. And the 22-year-old who has grown up in a totally different environment in terms of their interaction with their friends and peers and colleagues and stuff has a very different view about where they're physically located relative to where their work is. And I've seen it over and over and over again in the last 5 years. And I think that there is a generational phenomenon that I'm fully for, that blocks on technology in terms of that liberation. We've been talking about machines since I was 15. I think the next generation is going to be the first generation that has grown up with it to the point where that block doesn't exist. And I think that will change a lot of this kind of conversation. So
I agree and I disagree, because I mean, I definitely, I think the technology, is out there, and as we were talking about before, I do think there's a shift in terms of views of knowledge ownership and views of how you collaborate and views of how you work. But at the end of the day, when you have when you've got a problem that you got to sit down and work on, having people in the same physical space, I think is much more efficient, right?
I totally disagree. Except for, I think the physical space as a way to have an ability to deal with that communication in a virtual space is critical. So my example for that is my venture firm that I was part of before we started Foundry was West Coast based. And I was a satellite office, and I would never will that on any human being. It completely sucks to be a satellite office in venture capital. To do anything, you have to go to them.
Right.
When we started Foundry, one of our principles were all four of us need to be here, our families need to be here, we need to live together.
Right.
We don't spend a lot of physical time together. And we invest all over the country and we travel a lot. And we don't have long Monday partner meetings to resolve things, because we resolve things in real time. Because we have that ability to communicate via email, Skype, telephone, whatever, and sort through our issues. There are some companies, WordPress or Automatic is my favorite example. It's a 25-person company. It has 6 people in the Bay Area, spread all over the world. It's one of the most productive software companies that exists. And it's just, it's different. And I think we're, to sort of, the archetype that it has to be this way, I think is a dangerous one, especially with the next generation. But there's elements of the archetype.
And what I think is interesting about your example is you do have that, kind of your point was that you do have that space where you can come together and you've developed this trust over time. And I think that's, you have to have that face-to-face to develop that sort of thing.
So they get together as an entire company twice a year for a week. And if they didn't do that, they couldn't do what they did. But they don't have to get together any more than that because of the tools and technology and the culture that they create.
Yeah, that's interesting.
All I wanted to interject was the age.
Yeah, no, I think that's true.
Maybe a,
Can I add one thing to that? I mean, you're talking about a world where ideas are really the issues, right? And software is the same thing, right? But I think if you deal in the word hardware, it would be much more difficult to what you're talking about. Collaboration in the physical sense is much nearer. Yes. So in the world of ideas, software, which is very well managed, right?
It's very hard to run a farm.
Exactly. Right. And that's exactly because there's other things we talk about. When we're talking about location, we're talking about the flow of knowledge. But there's absolute location advantages. Do you need a coast? Do you need access to cheap electricity? And also the other.
This end of the spectrum.
Right.
I was agreeing. I was just saying. You guys are part of this.
Well, I think, just to put this in perspective, many people in this business actually invest in nonprofits unintentionally, right? And so I think that, while I agree with Brad that I'm old and that biases my view, what I would tell you is that, part of our job is to figure out how do we eliminate those variables that we can. And as models develop over the next 5 or 10 years where we see businesses that create a more virtualized environment and we start learning, so what are the management practices? What are the communication practices? It's surely not texting. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. There will be a set of managerial skills and behaviors and practices that emerge. And as that happens, then we'll see that adopted. But I think, right now I look at it and say, all other things being equal, if I have a choice of giving $1 million to 5 people in the same room that live in the same city, or 5 people in 5 different cities, I'll give it to the 5 people that are together. That is a bias. Over time, as I start seeing that model work effectively, I think that'll change. But right now, you can't control your competition. You can't control technology breakthroughs by others. So it's just, controlling controllable variables. And I think that the younger generations are going to think about it differently. But I think that there's a whole area of managerial behavior and thinking that has to develop about how that's really going to work for you to teach people to be effective managers if they only see someone 1 or 2 weeks a year. Mm-hmm. Because it's a very different skill, and it's not the same thing over telepresence in my estimation.
And figuring out what needs to be local and what can be diffused, I think, is really where the interesting questions are.
Meredith?
Yeah, it is. I agree with your point about it being a generation thing, and if they're growing up with Facebook, I don't know. I think of my brother and sister sitting on the couch next to each other, texting each other, and not talking. I mean, this is the image I have in my head right now, and this is the norm. Facebook, and there is a social component. You're absolutely right, and that's the reason why avatars exist in Second Life. There needs to be a human presence to these relationships, and there also needs to be a physical space aspect as well. And we don't. I wish we would work more on with the students on how to design spaces in the virtual, because I do think it is going to become more and more pervasive as a way of doing business. The brain doesn't know the difference between physical space, virtual space, or if you just close your eyes and imagine a space in your head. It's the same patterns of neurons being activated in each of those 3 examples. But place still matters. And in terms of memory formation and recall, the sort of sensory qualities of a space are going to matter, whether it's virtual or physical.
I was going to ask Brad if he's on Facebook right now. He's tweeting. So we've even gone further down the scale.
Yeah, right.
Of
we better step it up.
I'm actually communicating with my partner via voice.
Oh, thank you very much.
We're sorry we're boring you so much.
I think that's the difference in perception that really bothers me, actually. Is when I'm on my laptop, I'm actually more engaged than the kids in classes who run around. And when I'm on my phone, I'm probably actually taking notes of the conversation and not texting someone else. So I think that's a huge issue, is that technology enables us to communicate more effectively.
Yeah, it was. It's been remarkable to me as my role as an educator here at the university the last several years. I had the privilege for the last few days of having a guest lecture speaker in one of the series in one of my courses, and so I sat up behind the students, And some of them weren't aware that I did that because they came in late and they didn't realize where I was.
Anybody really good at mafia words?
I had a couple who were clearly trying to get to the next level. And this is a big class. I've got 160 people in this particular class. And just a couple of them. But by and large, all of them had their laptops open, and they might have been using an online media. It might not have been Microsoft Word, but they were using that in some way to engage the lecturer, which was fascinating to me. They're clearly thinking in a different way about this. So maybe, check the time, maybe to bring this back around, and then we'll leave about 10 minutes or so for general questions. In the industry, particularly in the industries we know here so well, software, hardware, I also wanted to raise the possibility and to see what our panel thought, and it just occurred to me while we were sitting here. It was last month or month before Wired magazine ran their article, and the cover story is "Atoms are the new bits." So if it's true that in software, and we can concede somewhere in this intellectual realm, that the exchange of intellectual ideas is becoming more slippery as time goes by. Are you seeing anything, I mean, particularly in your experiences in hardware manufacture, have you been seeing anything as a trend that's also slipping more to maybe not the startups, maybe not the core management team, but is that also beginning to become more of a virtual connection, or is there more virtual collaboration going on in hardware now than there has been traditionally, or is that catching up to software in any way?
Well, I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that. One, I'm not an engineer, and two, we operate at a really big scale. And one of the things that we've definitely had happen is we have multiple centers of development right now. Leave aside the manufacturing component of it, which all gets outsourced for the most part by us. But we do have multiple different campuses where they are centers of development, they're labs, and they have been distributed for a variety of reasons. Now, oftentimes they tend to specialize on particular product sets, so I'm not sure how much, I mean, yes, the things need to work together, but you are having core focus. So, yeah, there's the economic force that you're being driven to do that because you have to source the people from as many different places as you can. Immigration is somewhat restricted, and it's a barrier to get somebody to move as opposed to if you can put a campus there. So you are seeing more centers spread out, but the extent, I haven't seen a completely virtual hardware development project going on.
I've got.
I can tell you that what's happened over the last 30 years is that the methodologies for going into manufacturing have gotten more and more automated, and the ability to communicate between systems and so on, being able to ship all the data to build the mold and everything. This all becomes standard, and then management methods for transferring something from one to the other, from development into manufacturing have become much more formalized. We have been dealing with Asia for 20, 30 years. We started out with faxes because that was the only way to communicate, especially with the language difficulty the alphabet in their size. It's a real problem. But then, as I look at it, and we had to transfer manufacturing, and we had to find a way to get a product started, and even today, I think we definitely transfer product by sending a team of people for a short period of time. But the idea is short, right? But basically, the paperwork, if you will, between design and manufacturing is getting cleaner, more precise. And I can see, and that's what it is. The fact is, though, I think during the development process, where the iteration of ideas and so on and so forth, and people trying to get the best hardware design possible, I think I'm not sure that can be done in faraway places. Look at Seagate, the whole design effort is here in Longmont. Manufacturing facilities are everywhere else, right? place. I assume that they're...
It's here?
Or whatever.
That's Broomfield.
There's a lot of facility, a lot of work, a lot of manufacturing work being done outside the country in different places. But again, the design cycle, I think, has to be for a hardware product. I don't think we have the methodologies yet to be able to formalize parallel thinking without being physically the same.
I would just tell you, I've got two hardware companies that I'm currently an investor in, and we've talked about location, and we've been kind of singular in our discussion that either it needed to all be in the same place, or if it were large enough, you could virtualize some of it. The reality of the businesses I've invested in is that it's quite common in the hardware business that they end up with a design group, an engineering team. The engineering team, I would say, in every case that I've seen it, has needed to be together. It didn't have to be together where the rest of the company was. Mm-hmm. So I've got a company that's doing quite well where their engineering team was in Canada, and I've got another company that kept all of their engineering team in one location. So I think there are certain business functions where the root of that function needs to be present locally for them to be effective, given the complexity of what they're dealing with. But it doesn't mean that can't be remoted from other parts of the business, and that we frequently see. And then the only other thing I'd say that's just consistent with what Juan was saying is that we can't be competitive any longer manufacturing our product in the United States. So in every one of these cases, there's a stepwise plan to move that manufacturing typically first to Mexico and then second to somewhere over in Asia. And that'll change over time as those competitive dynamics change. But generally, it's designed in a cluster and built somewhere else.
Maybe I want to be mindful of time, and I know there's some questions that are beginning to bubble out here in the audience. I'd ask for maybe any last comments or observations or feelings from the panel.
Sean, why don't we take questions and we can do that?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So I do want to take a question from a student first, if there's a student who's got a question for us.
It's a former panelist.
I wanted to, first of all, build on what Brad said, that there's a slight bias on the panel because of age, a bunch of old people on the panel. That you're coming from a hardware perspective. But, I was just reading and exchanging my message with Richard Florida about Boulder, because my observations, based on what I've been reading, following what Brad has been talking about and so on, is that there are two dynamics at play over here. Number one, as Richard says, that this area is the greatest concentration of the creative class of almost any city in America, maybe in the world. Okay. That's a very interesting thing, because you have to walk around the city to see the nature of it. And the other part of the discussion we had today was about the level of exchange. I mean, one of the big differences between Boston and Silicon Valley is that Boston is obsessed with secrecy, and it's a closed, type of, almost New York investment banking type of, environment with all sorts of other problems. With Silicon Valley, it's the exact opposite. Here you have the best of both worlds. You have the openness, you have the, the natural beauty, you have the creative class, all of the advantages here. But I've also been challenging Michael Porter's theories, and the question that Bill had about China. Actually, I've spent a lot of time in China. I've gone there with a couple of great senior journalists, with other academics, to go down and look at exactly what's been happening there. Because on the surface, it's amazing. Even the announcement that happened today about the applied material setting up over there, when you peel the onion over there, applied material, there's 15,000 people, they're moving 300 jobs over there. Big deal. It's irrelevant. But what's happening there is that there's almost no innovation coming out of there. This whole cluster theory that it works for manufacturing, that you can have benefits to having the value chain be condensed. When it comes to innovation, it doesn't happen there. Unless you have the creative class that Boulder has, you will never get innovation. So China will not innovate basically by doing what they're doing. All of these cluster theories, all of this things is just bogus. Now the missing ingredient it's just not the creative class. You can't just take some bohemians, gays, and immigrants and so on, put them together and get the magic. The missing ingredient is the people that make the magic happen.
Brad, there are a whole bunch of people over here who got together and said, we're going to create a network here. I've spoken to about a dozen entrepreneurs today. This common thing I heard from them was that, hey, we help each other. That you can just go down, meet this person, they'll tell you about it, and so on. So that's the magic in this region. I'm probably going to write a story in Business Week about it, but that's my observation based on what I've heard from you folks so far.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? Up here in the left.
Bill, at the outset, you talked about impediments to companies expanding out from Colorado rather than being acquired by companies headquartered outside of Colorado. Could you go into those a little bit?
Well, I wish I had the answer to that issue, because that is the big question that many of the members of the creative class in this area have been grappling with for years here. I think one of them is just the physical location is challenging. It's while Denver is a relatively large city, it is not San Francisco, it is not New York, it is not Los Angeles, and it's also not located on a coast. So your ability to move people around globally is a big deal. And when United was when Boeing, both Boeing and United were trying to decide where they were going to headquarter, that was an issue, where are they going? And in competing against a place like Dallas, we had a bit of a disadvantage as a result of that. So I think that's one piece. I think just overall size is another piece. While Colorado has grown in population considerably over the 30 years that I've been here, it's still relatively small when you compare it to the major population centers around the world. So some of the benefits that you get of the urban economy aren't there. So I think that you have that aspect happening as well. I don't know the extent to which access to financial capital is an issue. We're not a real finance center, but I tend to agree with Kyle that money is relatively fungible, and I think that it will flow to where the ideas are here. And I'm not aware of any big companies that have sold that have done so because of lack of access to financing. I don't know. My best sense, and this is just a gut sense, is that one, it's a combination of urban size. Two, it's a combination of infrastructure. And three, it does come back to the network. Networks are really critical. And the network that you need to get a company started from ground zero and up to $10 million is different than going from 10 to 100, which is different from 100 to $1 billion. And you get up to a certain size, and at that point in time, I think we start losing our competitive advantage. Brad?
Can I add on to that? Because I think I'll challenge a slightly different approach. One of the values of the anchor tenants is the continual renewal of innovation around that anchor tenant ecosystem. There's an article, I think it was in Business Week last week, about all the Google angel investors that had come out of Google and all the activity around that and the networks between them. One of the things I've observed in 15 years of living here is that same phenomenon happens post-M&A.
Yeah,
so while there is no
absolutely.
Tenant, companies get acquired. They get acquired when they get to be, 25 to a couple hundred people. The acquirer benefits because they got something they want. They often integrate that product and technology more into their mainstream somewhere else. And after 2 or 3 years, the entrepreneurs and the senior people leave and start another company. And when I moved here in 95, there was definitely a much less vibrant turnover of that. And I think sort of run up to the bubble, there was a certain dynamic. But really post-bubble, you had a generation of entrepreneurs who had been through 2 or 3 companies, one success, maybe a failure, whatever. But they really run in packs, so you still get that phenomenon that you get if you had a big anchor tenant. And then the counterbalance there, and I'm focused much more on Boulder than I am on Colorado, is that you do have a limited population. It's only 150,000 people, so you do have a scale issue. But I think in terms of the entrepreneur innovation dynamic, you actually get the same benefit that you get.
So, Brad, I would generally agree with you there with 1 or 2 exceptions. And the big exceptions that I've seen between the difference of having a locally headquartered large company as opposed to a division fall into 2 areas. The first is contributions to the community. And a company like Storage Tech, I think, based on my experience, was more closely tied to this community and contributing to the community than Sun was. And not to say that Sun people didn't go out and do their things, but when it came to corporate giving and that sort of thing, you're going to have more of a local focus. The second area that I think that gets impacted when you have a headquarters move someplace else is in that circle of supporting economies, particularly among the service providers. So you will see work that's going to the local accounting offices, the local law firms, and that sort of thing move to someplace else. Those are the two things that I think that you lose by having a regional presence as opposed to a headquarters.
Let's just to be mindful of time, if we can get in one or two more questions. We can do it over dinner. This gentleman in the front, third
I think there's another dimension that needs to come into play. I'm allowed now anyway. I think there's another dimension that comes into play here. When I started my career building telecommunications products over 20 years ago, and for a Fortune 5 company, and it took us at least 1,000 people and $100 million to do anything. Okay. Last company I came from before starting the venture I'm in now, we build pretty much an equivalent type product that took 40 people and $5 million to get going. So the scale is a lot different now, and call it the cheap revolution or what you want, but you don't need the massive amount of capital or headcount to do some pretty amazing things nowadays. So one of the questions I have is, do we really need the big, large companies, the massive ones that we used to have, the IBMs and the AT&Ts of the world, or can we do with a lot more smaller companies to provide the same innovation, the left-hand networks, and I was going to use Enphase, but they're not around anymore, I guess.
My reaction is that that's a particularly astute statement, because if you've got a viable economy, whether it's made up of a large company or two or a bunch of smaller ones, then what matters is, have you built an ecosystem with the right resources to allow people that want to innovate to be able to go out and find the right team, get the support, and do that. So I think it's a very interesting observation that the fact that we don't have as many large companies headquartered here in certain technology areas doesn't mean that we can't have technology innovation in those areas. The biggest, I guess the only difference is that for a long period of time, those large companies were the only place that spent the money to train the people deeply enough that they could leave and innovate. And I'm not sure to what extent that still even happens anymore. But that was one of the correlates long ago, was that you had large technology companies investing in training and education, and that's what prepared someone to be able to innovate. And I'm not sure that that's even a big part of what big companies spend their money on now.
So I see Brad is hovering in the wing. Any last comments from the panel? Great. Thank you all very, very much.